The murder of one person is an enormous tragedy for the entire family. The murder of an entire family is a tragedy for all of society. But what if the person responsible for wiping out a whole family turns out to be someone no one in society, or even the family itself, would ever have suspected? And even the perpetrator himself never expected such a heartbreaking outcome. This is the tragic story of the Mori family, a story that will make you think twice about your own actions, so that, in trying to do good, you don't make fatal mistakes. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. It was a bitterly cold night in Fishkill, New York, a town known for its quiet streets and family neighborhoods. But in the early morning of January 19, 2007, the usual silence of the town was shattered by total chaos. Red and blue lights flashed, sirens wailed on a normally peaceful road as emergency vehicles pushed through thick clouds of smoke rising from a two-story house on Route 82. Passing drivers stopped. Some tried to help, while others simply froze in place. Not so much because of the cold winter air, but because of the fear they felt watching firefighters enter the burning home. Neither years of training nor the experience of putting out countless fires could prepare the rescuers for what awaited them in those smoke-filled rooms. As the firefighters made their way upstairs through the thick smoke, one of them bumped into something soft. He quickly scooped the lifeless body into his arms and carried it out into the fresh air. When the rescuer stepped into the light, the full horror of the tragedy became clear. In his arms was a child. To the firefighters' horror, the little boy had not only been harmed by fire and smoke, his tiny body was covered in wounds, clear signs of a brutal attack. Before the firefighters could recover from the first shock, another small body was carried out of the house, and then another. Each one bore traces of unimaginable violence. And the horror didn't end there. This was not an accidental fire. This was a deliberate massacre. Everyone has seen those perfect family photos on social media. Mom, dad, and kids all wearing matching sweaters, smiling sweetly, with the dog lying at their feet. You look at that flawless picture and think everything in that family is perfect, that they all love each other and are truly happy. That's exactly how the Mori family appeared from the outside. On the surface, Tony and Tina looked like a classic American couple. Tony was the kind of dad who spent weekends riding ATVs in the woods with his sons instead of lounging on the couch in front of the TV. Tina was a cheerful, outgoing mom whose warmth enveloped not just her kids, but everyone around her. She had an energy that drew people to her like a magnet. Tina was the mother of 3 boys. Tony Jr., Adam, and Ryan formed their own little suburban dream team. Each had his own personality and interests: football, baseball, cartoons. They were ordinary kids with their own dreams and desires. Let's go back a few years to get to know the Mori family better. Manuel, whom everyone called Tony, and Tina met in the early 1990s. They soon married and were now raising 3 sons. Their firstborn, born in July 1993, was named Manuel after his father and grandfather, but he was better known as Tony Jr. A few years later, in June 1996, their second son, Adam, was born. And in October 2000, Ryan arrived. The Mori family lived in Fishkill, New York, a small town with a population of just under 23,000. The people of Fishkill felt safe and comfortable. It was the kind of place where people moved to slow down, start a family, and buy a cozy little house with a backyard perfect for neighborhood barbecues. That was exactly the life Tony and Tina dreamed of. They rented a home at 203 Route 82, and the neighbors quickly welcomed the new family into the community. The Morris were seen as good people, reliable tenants, and a perfectly ordinary, close-knit family. The 3 boys were the light that made their parents get up every morning. Tony Jr. was the most outgoing kid. He played football and wrestled. Adam, the middle child, was the funniest. He cracked jokes at every opportunity and always tried to make everyone around him laugh. He loved baseball, while Ryan, the youngest, was the sweetest, gentlest little boy who still loved Saturday morning cartoons and looked up to his big brothers. The boys were especially close with their grandfather Manuel, who loved spoiling his grandsons and playing silly pranks on them. For example, after they all watched Alien together, Grandpa pulled out his dentures, scaring and amusing the boys at the same time. He affectionately called them the Three Stooges because they were always getting into mischief and keeping him on his toes. But when Grandma died after a long illness, it was the boys who supported Manuel the most. Tony Jr. was in middle school, while Adam and Ryan attended the same elementary school. For a while, everything in the family seemed stable, but Tony wasn't satisfied with their financial situation. He wanted more for his kids, so in 2006 he tried starting a business with one of his closest friends. Unfortunately, nothing came of it, and Tony became even more disappointed in himself. The Morris tried to keep up appearances that everything was fine, but the problems that had started creeping in back in 2005 were snowballing. They fell behind on rent. Tina worked as a cashier at a small store, and Tony took on any odd job he could find. Yet there was still never enough money. The Mori family had always lived modestly. No designer clothes, no expensive cars. But now, even basic expenses were hard to cover, and financial stress can hit even the strongest relationships hard. The Morris still attended their kids' games and school events. Tina still posted cheerful updates on social media, and no one around them yet suspected the family was going through a serious crisis. But soon the landlord noticed the house wasn't being kept up like before. The rent debt kept growing, and eviction talks began. The boys also sensed tension in the home. Though their parents never spoke openly about it, all the signs of an approaching disaster were there. Tony started drinking more and staying out late. He wasn't just drinking, he had begun using drugs to cope with stress. Then Tony occasionally started selling cocaine to friends because he was desperate to keep the family from losing their home. He probably never even considered the risk. It seemed like a small side hustle with huge consequences. He thought everything was under control, that the problems were temporary, and he'd fix it all. To protect the kids and the family's reputation, he kept his bad habits hidden from everyone around him. But in a small town like Fishkill, secrets are hard to keep, and people started whispering that something wasn't right in the Mori family. All this time, Tina was torn between hope and reality. Her life revolved around her sons, their safety, and their future. Meanwhile, her husband stayed out late, got drunk, and barely cared about his wife. Tina began confiding in friends that she might leave Tony until he got himself together. She talked about moving to another state, putting some distance between them to show Tony what he risked losing if she and the boys left. The young woman dreamed of going to law school to secure a stable future for her family. The life she imagined wasn't this chaotic. Tony and Tina's marriage wasn't a failure. They loved each other. It was just that resentment had started to build. Tension and stress ruled between them. Tony knew he was ruining everything, that Tina was pulling away. But his need to escape reality with drugs had turned into a real addiction, and it kept him trapped. By late 2006, Tony Mori was 33, and his wife, Tina, was 30. Their sons were growing up fast. Tony Jr. was already 13, Adam was 10, and Ryan was 6. The new year, 2007, was supposed to be a fresh start, setting goals and achieving them. Each of the boys had his own dreams, and no one could have imagined what would happen in 2007. On January 19, 2007, at 4 a.m., several frantic 911 calls reported flames pouring from the back of the Mori house. Most people should have been asleep, but 2 passing drivers spotted the fire. One after another, they pulled over, jumped out, and ran to the house, pounding on doors and windows, shouting desperately to wake those inside. Multiple fire departments responded. When they arrived, the back of the house was fully engulfed, thick smoke pouring from every window. Firefighters entered through the front door, where the flames were less intense, and headed upstairs. But the situation grew increasingly tense. Every room was filled with dense smoke. Heat was rising, visibility dropping. Wearing oxygen masks, the rescuers slowly pushed through the dark smoke until they reached the staircase and climbed to the second floor. On the landing, they saw two doors, one on the left, one on the right, so they split up. One firefighter opened a door and immediately dropped to the floor to crawl toward the bed. When he banged his head on the bed frame, he turned on his flashlight and saw the outline of a small body on the pillow. He realized it was a child. The firefighter grabbed the lifeless body and raced outside, hoping he wasn't too late. Only when he laid the boy on the ground did he see the pajamas covered in bloodstains. The child was later identified as 13-year-old Tony Jr. The house was large enough that if one child was inside, the parents had to be somewhere too. The firefighter rushed back into the burning building to search for others. He returned to the same bedroom and found a second child lying under one of the windows. Tragically, this boy was also dead. It was 10-year-old Adam. Despite multiple fire trucks on scene, flames still shot from the house. Rescuers searched every room to make sure no one else was inside. While checking the first floor, they found a third body in the dining room. Unbelievably, and to their horror, it was the third child, even smaller than the first two. The boy was carried out and laid on the ground. The firefighters knelt beside the boys' bodies, stunned, because it was clear all three had died not from smoke inhalation. Someone had inflicted multiple wounds on them. Seasoned rescuers had never seen anything like it in their careers. They were in shock and disbelief. Since this was no ordinary fire but a crime scene, police were already on their way. The first detective arrived while firefighters were still battling the remaining flames. A red tarp lay on the ground in front of the house, covering the bodies of 13-year-old Tony Jr., 10-year-old Adam, and 6-year-old Ryan. The detective had to figure out what happened here. While firefighters finished their work, the officer canvassed neighbors, asking who lived in the house. When told it was the Morey family of 5, the detective approached the rescuers and explained that 2 more adults should still be inside. Once the fire was out and the smoke began to clear, firefighters conducted a more thorough search. They soon discovered a 4th victim in the living room. However, the body was so severely charred that it was impossible to identify gender at first glance. The 4th body was eventually identified as 30-year-old Tina Morey. Her 33-year-old husband, Tony, was the only family member still missing. As investigators examined the scene, they found no obvious signs of forced entry. Fire and smoke damage was everywhere, but the back of the house, where Tina was found, suffered the most. Upstairs, where the boys were found, blood splatters and pools covered much of the bedroom floor, and a bloody adult handprint was visible on one wall. After photographing all evidence in the house, New York State Police investigators began examining the surrounding area. Though the firefighters had left many footprints, fresh tire tracks and a strange patch of melted snow stood out, like a vehicle had idled there long enough to melt the ice. Someone clearly wasn't in a hurry. About 20 minutes after the house fire, another 911 call reported a burning car on the roadside less than a mile away. The vehicle was parked on Lime Kiln Road near Route 82. Firefighters rushed to the scene and found a fully engulfed 2003 Kia. They suspected a connection. First the house, then a car nearby. After extinguishing the flames, thankfully, no one was inside. Investigators ran the plates and discovered the Kia was registered to Manuel Morey, Tony Morey's father. Searching the area, officers found several .22 caliber shell casings right under the seats and a blood-soaked pair of gloves tossed into the snow nearby. The burned car was now a second crime scene. Whoever left the evidence behind clearly hoped it would be destroyed in the fire. The perpetrator was in a rush, trying to disappear unnoticed. At first glance, with 4 family members dead and Tony missing, plus his father's car burning nearby, it looked like Tony might have done the unthinkable. Maybe he snapped, killed his entire family in a rage, set the house on fire, drove off, and torched the car to destroy evidence. But it didn't take investigators long to realize that theory didn't hold up. The medical examiner examined each body and, while examining Tina's remains, discovered something shocking. As mentioned earlier, her body was so charred it was initially unidentifiable. But as the examiner tried to make sense of inconsistencies, he realized he wasn't looking at one person, but two. The couple had burned so severely that Tony Mori's body had literally fused to his wife's. They were locked in a final, fatal embrace. They were holding each other when they were killed and then burned. The medical report described how they had melted together, giving the impression of one person when there were actually two. So now Tony had to be considered another victim. All 5 members of the Mori family were confirmed dead. The burned Kia registered to Tony's father was also tied to the case. Investigators now knew Tony hadn't been driving it. Authorities faced an extremely complex situation with far too many unanswered questions. Tina had to be identified through dental records due to the condition of her remains. Her body was so damaged by fire that tracing bullet paths or fragments was nearly impossible. Still, it was determined she had been shot 3 times. Once in the back of the head, once in the chest, and once through the palate. Her husband, Tony, suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the neck. Like Tina, the condition of his body made determining the exact bullet trajectory very difficult. Their eldest son, 13-year-old Tony Jr., suffered over 80 stab wounds, many classified as defensive. The boy fought so desperately that the killer clearly lost control. Both Tony Jr. and his 10-year-old brother Adam died from multiple stab wounds to the face and neck. 6-year-old Ryan suffered combined trauma. He was struck on the head with a heavy object and also stabbed. The doctor noted that Ryan's blood carbon monoxide level indicated he was still breathing when the fire spread through the house. So in addition to his other injuries, the fire contributed to his death. The next morning at 9:30, Tony Jr.'s teacher called his grandmother, the emergency contact, because the boy hadn't shown up to school and his parents weren't answering calls. Tina's mother, Arlene, had no idea her daughter and entire family were dead. The school employee told the grandmother that students were talking about a fire on Route 82, but no details were known. Arlene had already tried reaching her daughter and son-in-law with no answer on home or cell phones. She thought it strange. By noon, all relatives had heard about the tragedy, but no one knew exactly what had happened to the Mori family. The family was so worried they gathered and went to the police station hoping for answers. But even there, they were told nothing concrete. Tina's mother, Arlene, and her husband waited in the hallway for news from investigators. Arlene grew so tired of waiting, she decided to go to the hospital. If her daughter and grandsons were there, she needed to be with them. Unfortunately, police knew all 5 Morris were dead, and not in a hospital, but in the morgue. They couldn't bring themselves to tell the family. When Arlene headed determinedly for the exit, an officer had to stop her in the hallway and say there was nothing more she could do for her loved ones. Finally, the officer was forced to deliver the heartbreaking news that all 5 members of the Mori family were gone. As expected, Arlene collapsed right there on the floor, unable to process the horrific truth. Once she was revived, she called the rest of the family and, through tears, told them everyone was dead. Arlene felt utterly lost without Tina and the boys. They had been the meaning of her life. The hardest was for Tony's father, Grandpa Manuel. He had been closest to his son's family. The night of the fire, Manuel had been working the night shift. The next morning, 2 investigators showed up at his door to inform him that his 2003 Kia had been found burning on the roadside. He explained he had given the car to his son back in 2005. At first, he was completely confused by the police visit, but when one detective told him about the fire at the Mori house and that no one survived, Manuel was devastated. The news was the second blow after losing his wife. His grandsons were what kept him going, but Grandpa didn't yet know they hadn't just died. They had been brutally murdered. Not only relatives, but everyone who knew the Morris were in shock and couldn't understand who could commit such a crime. Grief counseling was arranged for the boys' schools. The terrible tragedy shook all of Fishkill. People feared they could be next. Meanwhile, the investigation began. Detectives combed every inch of the house and concluded an accelerant had been used to start the fire in the rear. Given the victim's injuries and the amount of blood in the boys' bedroom, investigators suspected the killer may have been cut or injured during the attack. They began calling local hospitals to see if anyone had recently sought treatment for such wounds. Authorities also asked the public to report any unexplained injuries among acquaintances. In the days that followed, the area around the burned house became a memorial. Along the wooden fence surrounding the ruins, people left flowers, stuffed animals, and notes with photos of the boys. On Thursday, January 25th, with state police permission, the Morey home was demolished. By then, detectives and experts had collected all significant evidence. Now they had to find the killer. Investigators used every resource available. One key lead came from a New York State police officer patrolling Route 82 the morning of the fire. His patrol car was equipped with a mobile license plate reader that captured every plate in view. This allowed them to track which vehicles were near the Morey house around the time the fire started, before 3 a.m. Route 82 is the main road through Fishkill, New York. The system captured thousands of images, so reviewing them was a slow, meticulous process. Processing the data took time. Teams conducting witness interviews agreed Tony Morey had a drug problem and may have been involved in selling. Could that have been the motive for such a brutal attack? It wasn't about painting the victim as a bad guy, but about understanding his lifestyle, where he went, who he associated with. On January 29th, just 10 days after the fire, a major breakthrough occurred. Local teens playing hockey on a frozen lake lost their puck in bushes near the shore. While searching, they found a blood-soaked hunting knife and immediately called police. The lake was only a 20-minute drive from the Morey house, so police called in divers to search the water. They recovered several highly relevant items: blood-stained boxer shorts with hearts and kisses, a locked metal box, a firearm, blue pants, and long shorts. Everything was sent to the New York State Police Crime Lab. Detectives now had a mountain of evidence, but still no clear suspect. However, the metal safe was confirmed to belong to Tony. Relatives verified he kept it under his bed. Since there were no signs of forced entry at the Morey home, investigators believed the victims knew their killer, possibly someone they trusted. Naturally, detectives looked closely at everyone close to the family. That brought 18-year-old Francis Cannon under suspicion. The troubled teen had been expelled from multiple schools and had a criminal record. Despite his issues, Tina had taken Frankie under her wing and treated him like another son. He slept on their couch, ate at their table, and essentially lived with them for weeks before the murders. Had Tina's kindness become the tragic reason her entire family was killed? Could Frankie, a difficult teen with a dark past, have done something so horrific to people who had shown him nothing but generosity? However, Francis was quickly cleared when it turned out he was in jail at the time of the crime. 3 days earlier, he had broken into the high school for thrills. He called it a bad joke that landed him in county lockup. Still, Frankie told police about the safe under Tony's bed, where, he said, cash and cocaine were kept. The young man said Tony was very careful and never spoke of it around the kids or Tina to shield them from that side of his life. Frankie swore he never told anyone about the safe, but when the kids were at Grandma's, people often came to the house to buy drugs. Though he had a bad reputation, Frankie genuinely loved the Morey family and was devastated by their deaths. The investigation was back to square one. Tony clearly lived a secret life his wife and children knew nothing about. So who else knew about his addiction and financial vulnerability? Detectives started asking around, and one name kept coming up: Charles Gileo, an old friend of Tony's from high school. After graduation, they stayed close, riding ATVs together, having barbecues. Friends and neighbors described Charlie and Tony as inseparable brothers. Detectives wanted to ask Charlie a few questions since he would know a lot about his friend. But the man showed little interest in talking to police. That surprised the officers, but what interested them more was the fresh cut on Charlie's forehead. Gileo claimed he got it riding an ATV in the woods, but that didn't match his story of wearing a full-face helmet. According to Charlie, the night the Mori family died, he was drinking at home all night with his buddy Mark Serrano, a sanitation worker, and never left the house. Then another detail emerged. The lake where the bloody clothes, safe, knife, and gun were found was right near Mark Serrano's house. Coincidence? Or were these two somehow involved in wiping out an entire family? Since Tony occasionally bought drugs, police tracked down his supplier, who said he sold cocaine that night to two of Tony's friends, Charles Gileo and Mark Serrano. Clearly, the dealer's information contradicted what Charlie and Mark had told police. They had lied about their whereabouts. Using the mobile license plate reader data, investigators checked whether Serrano's or Gileo's vehicles were near the Mori house during the crime. Mark Serrano's car was there. As detectives built their timeline, they learned Tony and Charlie had recently fallen out badly over drugs. Tony had even told Gileo to stay away from him and his family. Physical evidence backed up the suspicions. DNA tests on the items from the lake came back positive. Adams and Ryan's blood was on the shorts. Tony Jr.'s DNA was on the blue pants and the heart print boxer shorts, recognized by Mark Serrano's girlfriend, who had given them to him 3 years earlier for Valentine's Day. The gun matched the one used to shoot Tony and Tina, so those clothes most likely belonged to the killer. As the investigation progressed, more evidence surfaced. Phone records showing calls from Charlie to the Mori house that night, the meeting with the dealer, car seat covers stained with the Mori brothers' blood found under Serrano's sink, and Tony's blood on the floor mat of Mark's car. At first, when Mark Serrano was brought in for questioning, he insisted he and Charlie were never at Tony's house. Then he admitted they had called Tony asking where to get more coke. Only when detectives pressed him did Serrano confess he drove Charlie to the Mori house, but stayed in the car. He couldn't explain how his distinctive boxer shorts ended up soaked in victims' blood and dumped in the lake behind his own house. According to Mark, he waited 2 hours before Charlie came back out. Instead of getting into Serrano's car, Gileo took Tony's Kia and drove off, the same Kia that later burned. Mark didn't know what had happened inside, so he just followed Charlie. He saw Gileo get out of the Kia, toss something onto the front seat, and then the car went up in flames. In later interrogations, Mark Serrano gave several more conflicting versions of that night. Finally, Charlie Gileo was arrested and his home thoroughly searched. Nothing incriminating was found there. Charlie stayed silent. From the moment handcuffs went on until he was driven to the station, he didn't say a word. He invoked his right to remain silent. Later, once in a cell, he told detectives he didn't do it. And if he did, he didn't remember. By then, experts had examined the bloody handprint on the boy's bedroom wall. It perfectly matched Mark Serrano's right palm, directly linking him to the attack on the Mori family. This was direct physical evidence, and police now had enough to hold the suspect. A long, intense, and exhausting 9-hour interrogation followed the arrest. Despite all the evidence, Serrano stuck to the same story and maintained his innocence. When asked how his bloody handprint ended up in the room where 2 brothers died, he admitted he went inside briefly to look for Charlie, slipped in blood, and braced himself against the wall. He insisted he never hurt anyone. Realizing something terrible had happened, Mark ran back to his car. That, he claimed, was how Tony's blood got in his vehicle. But he couldn't explain how the boy's blood got on his underwear. So, 29-year-old Mark Serrano and 33-year-old Charles Gileo were formally charged with murder in connection with the deaths of the Mori family. Both men pleaded not guilty. While the case moved to pre-trial proceedings, they were held without bail. When news of the arrests broke, the people of Fishkill were stunned. The whole town had been anxiously waiting to learn which of the two men was responsible for such a horrific act against 5 innocent people everyone knew and loved. Now the authorities' job was to ensure the person who committed such violence would never walk free again. Hundreds attended the memorial service for the 5 members of the Mori family at a Fishkill church. Classmates, teachers, neighbors, friends, and strangers touched by the tragedy came to pay their respects. Photos of Tony, Tina, and their 3 sons hung everywhere in the church. Handwritten messages from classmates to the boys covered one wall. Sadly, tragedies like this bring communities together. Mark Serrano's trial began in November 2007. The courtroom was packed. Media filled the room, camera flashes everywhere. Prosecutors laid out a chilling story to the jury. With horrifying clarity, they described the brutality inflicted on the Mori family, including 3 minor boys. Many jurors cried listening to the prosecution. Here's what happened that fateful night, according to the defendant's own admission. On January 18th, he and Charlie spent most of the day in the car drinking and snorting coke. Around 10 p.m., they met their weed dealer. Then Charlie suggested driving to Tony's to buy more coke. Charlie went into the Mori house first, alone. About 10 minutes later, Mark followed and saw the 2 men talking in the living room. At some point, Charlie pulled a gun from his hoodie pocket, pointed it straight at Tony's face, and fired. Tina pushed Charlie away and rushed to help her husband. Gileo then walked up to Tina and shot her 3 times. Mark Serrano panicked, ran out of the living room, got in his car, and drove home. There he changed clothes and did more coke to calm down. About an hour and a half later, Mark returned to the Mori house to pick up Charlie. Peeking into one of the bedrooms, he saw a little boy lying motionless on the bed. When Serrano touched the child's leg, he saw a huge pool of blood underneath. Panicking, he braced his hand against the wall, then bolted outside. He then saw Charlie coming out of the house with an empty gas can. Gileo got into Tony's Kia, drove a short distance, and set the car on fire. Afterward, Mark drove Charlie home. Serrano continued to insist he never killed anyone. Nevertheless, after deliberating, the jury returned its verdict. Mark was found guilty on all 31 counts. The judge sentenced him to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2056. Charles Gileo's trial took place in 2008. The defendant remained calm, controlled, and mostly silent. Defense attorneys claimed the real villain was Mark Serrano and that he dragged Charlie into the crime. But testimony from a witness to whom Charlie personally confessed everything changed the case. The witness was the same drug dealer Mark and Charlie had met the night before. Gileo called him early that morning, before the attack was public, and said the entire Mori family was dead. Charlie said he killed the youngest first and made the father watch. Then he finished off Tony, Tina, and the other 2 boys. Previously convicted Mark Serrano also testified. He told the jury that tension between Charlie and Tony had grown. That night, angry at his childhood friend, Gileo suggested robbing Tony's house. Murder was never part of the plan. But everything went wrong. To cover the crime, Charlie set the house on fire, and then his so-called brother Tony's car. Charles Gileo was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his days behind bars. Charles Gileo and Tony Mori once called each other brothers, but when drugs entered the picture, that friendship vanished. Tony's 3 sons saw Charlie as an uncle, and he literally stabbed them in the back. Manuel Mori, Tony's father, lost all will to live after his son and grandsons were gone. It was as if he waited only until the killers were brought to justice. A few months after the trials, in May 2008, he passed away. He was only 57. It was over. His family was gone. First, his wife died after a long illness, then his son, daughter-in-law, and 3 grandsons. There was nothing left for Manuel on this earth. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Once, giving in to temptation can ruin an entire future life. Ansreen Bukhari never suspected what her funny dance videos with her rising TikTok star daughter would lead to. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Masacre Bukhari, a promising TikTok star known under the pseudonym May, was 24 years old, while her mother Ansreen was 44. Mother and daughter once appeared together in a cute dance video where they moved synchronously to rhythmic music. The clip gained a huge number of views. All viewers unanimously wrote that they looked more like sisters than parent and child. As a result, Ansreen gained a certain fame and began appearing more often with her daughter in videos and live streams. One day during a live broadcast, May and her mom were reading comments, chatting with viewers and answering questions. One commenter, clearly from a fake account, asked the girl to have her mother call him. May just laughed it off. She didn't notice how Ansreen's face twitched at that moment. Apologizing to the viewers, the woman went to the bathroom and nervously put the phone to her ear. She begged the person on the other end to stop stalking her and not to involve her daughter. She even threatened the police, but the caller had no intention of calming down. The fact was that he had somehow obtained her husband's phone number and offered to send him hot videos featuring his wife. The woman's heart almost jumped out of her chest. She immediately found those messages on her husband's phone. She was lucky that her husband paid no attention to them, deciding it was just another hater. The Bukhari family was quite well known on social media thanks to Masacre, who had created the account and periodically showed her relatives to the public. On TikTok, the girl presented the image of a proper religious family, and now, because of the mother, her entire career was under threat. Moreover, it could destroy Ansreen's marriage and ruin their future. That was the exact threat she received in a new text message on her phone. One click, and everything would collapse. The marriage, her daughter's career, her own reputation, and social status. But, as it turned out, Ansreen and her daughter Masacre decided to do anything to prevent that, even if several people had to suffer. This story happened relatively recently in Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire, United Kingdom. There is a platform on the internet called Azar. It resembles chat roulette where you can meet and talk to people from all over the world. Users can set filters based on their preferences, location, gender, age, etc. The platform gained huge popularity during the pandemic, when people were locked in their homes and bored. One day, Ansreen's niece came to visit. While the woman was doing housework, the girl sat in the living room video chatting with a young man around 20 from the UK. The schoolgirl was proud that her relatives were famous and proudly told the guy that her cousin was the famous blogger May and that she was currently staying at their house. She even turned the camera to show her Aunt Ansreen to prove she wasn't making it up and was really visiting the Bukharis. The niece said this was May's mom and that the videos where she danced with her daughter had gained a huge number of views. The woman waved at the camera, smiled, and went back to her chores. She didn't take such remote communication seriously and wasn't really listening to what the teenagers were talking about. Masacre wanted to become famous not only in the UK, she was doing everything possible to become a star. She danced to trendy tracks, used all kinds of video features, and tried to attract attention in every way. Masacre even persuaded her mom to dance with her, and didn't lose. Videos featuring Ansreen gained hundreds of times more views and comments. The TikToker started involving not only her mom, but also her brother and even her father in filming. True, the father didn't appear in videos very often because he didn't quite understand youth trends and was quite serious in the clips, but it all looked very sweet. Together, it created the image of a wonderful, loving family. Masacre claimed to be a devout Muslim woman and wrote a lot about her faith and morality in society. She talked about how she loved and valued her mom, who was both her best friend and sister to her. But her main interest and ultimate goal was to become an influencer in the fashion world. Masacre dreamed of advertising fashionable clothes on her social media. wanted famous brands to send her outfits, and she would tag them. She had already received several offers, but dreamed of more. With 126,000 followers at the time, she earned money through brand promotions and events across the UK. She was also invited to promote local restaurants, bars, and especially shisha lounges. Each time she took her mom with her because the image of a conservative family didn't allow a girl to go to such entertainment venues alone, and her mom really was her best friend. Mahek even convinced Ansreen to create her own social media account, insisting that the number of mom's fans would also allow her to earn from advertising. Perhaps that was exactly what Ansreen had always dreamed of. She was 44, worked as a managing director at a security firm. All her life, someone else had made decisions for her. As a teenager, she wanted to be a flight attendant, but her parents said they had found her a husband and she would marry him and have children. Ansreen did just that. She was quite happy in family life, but she had never had that youthful period full of emotions when new horizons make your head spin. She went straight from teenager to housewife. Outwardly, Ansreen's life was perfect. She had everything one could dream of: her own house, a wonderful, hard-working husband who fully supported the family, grown children. But lately, she got a special thrill from going to bars and communicating with energetic, carefree young people dressed in bright, fun clothes. Ansreen was delighted with this new life. She created her own account and regularly checked her messages. One day, among several meaningless messages, one caught her eye. The man was named Saqib Hussein, and for some reason his appearance seemed familiar. It was the same guy her niece had been video chatting with while visiting their house. The comment was quite innocent, but Ansreen felt there was more behind it. Regular correspondence began between her and Saqib. Then the communication smoothly moved to daily phone calls. They called each other up to 5 times a day when Ansreen's husband wasn't home. It was like cute teenage lovers' chatter. No matter what the woman was doing, Saqib was always there, on the other end of the line. Mahek knew her mom was talking to some guy, but didn't think much of it, considering them just friends. It never even crossed her mind that a romance was developing between them. Saqib was young, attractive, in good physical shape. But most importantly, he was literally obsessed with her. According to him, he had just turned 27, while Ansreen was 44. A 17-year age difference didn't seem so huge. An adult woman was flattered by the attention of a young man. Saqib was of legal age, so nothing illegal was happening. Only moral standards were violated. In reality, Saqib had lied. He was 18 when they started talking. But the guy did everything to appear older. He tried hard to please his beloved. He would suddenly appear at a shisha lounge or bar where Ansreen was helping her daughter promote the venue and pay for their treats. He sent gifts to her home that she had to unwrap in front of the whole family, pretending she had ordered them herself online. Eventually, their relationship changed. They couldn't meet often because they lived in different cities. Plus, Ansreen was married and had 2 children, so she didn't want to arouse suspicion. But when they did meet in hotels in Birmingham and London, everything became more and more explicit. Even during video calls, sparks flew that could burn everything inside. They often engaged in intimate activities hundreds of kilometers apart. It was an exciting, scandalous affair where Ansreen was essentially walking on a knife's edge. She could be caught at the worst moment, and the consequences would be devastating. As it turned out, this was actually Ansreen's second affair since marriage. The first was with a married man who also had children. So in that sense, they understood each other and didn't demand more than just physical connection. Both were cheating on their partners, but weren't planning to destroy their families. For them, it was a kind of outlet. But with Saqib, it was completely different. He wasn't married, had no children. He was young, hot-headed, and madly in love with Ansreen. She was his ultimate goal. After 2 years of this affair, the woman decided to end it. She met Saqib at a hotel and told him she wanted to focus on her marriage. Ansreen was tired of constant stress, felt guilty toward her husband and children. She could no longer lead a double life. The lovers spent one last night together, and the next morning it was as if nothing had been said the day before. Saqib started sending messages non-stop, clinging to Ansreen. Now that he knew she wanted to leave, he did everything to keep her. The guy called the woman 5 to 10 times a day, asking what she was doing and where she went. Her timid attempts to explain that her husband was starting to suspect something had no effect. It didn't stop Saqib. As soon as he felt Ansreen pulling away, he sent her photos of designer items on their way to her house. Even though his adult girlfriend refused, saying she didn't need anything, he ignored her and kept buying gifts. At the same time, the guy began showing control. If Ansreen refused the surprises, he got angry. Finally, in December 2021, the woman gathered her courage and broke up with Saqib for good. She expected swearing, endless calls, angry emails, and was even mentally prepared for it. But she hoped the guy would eventually calm down. It would all get boring for him, and he would move on. But instead, Saqib sent Ansreen her explicit photos and videos from their intimate calls. Then he bombarded her with messages that if she didn't answer, he would forward everything to her husband or, worse, make it public online. Ansreen felt there was only one way out of this. At that time, her daughter Masacre, the rising TikTok star, had no idea what was happening behind her back. She didn't even suspect who was posting explicit deepfake videos with her face that were destroying her life and reputation. They looked so realistic that the unsuspecting public could easily take them for real. It was especially painful because Masacre had built her career as a religious, multifaceted woman. Fake photos and videos could ruin everything she had worked so hard for, and even her friends started asking questions. Initially, the girl couldn't imagine that her own mother was to blame. In December 2021, after Ansreen broke up with Saqib, she gathered her courage and told her daughter everything. She did it not just to unburden her soul, but rather to get help in the difficult situation she had created herself. Ansreen felt she had no other choice, being trapped by her own desires. First, Masacre threw a huge tantrum. She was furious and attacked her mother for cheating on her father and risking destroying not only her own life, but the lives of those close to her. Then her anger shifted to Saqib. Masacre paced the living room, getting angrier and angrier. The guy was the main threat to both her family and her entire career she had worked so hard for. The girl was determined to do anything to avoid the negative consequences of her mother's secret affair. Masacre calmed her mother by saying she would take care of Saqib herself. She would ask her friends to deal with him, after which he wouldn't even dare say Ansreen's name. Masacre set in motion a plan that would land 8 people in prison. First, she called her best friend, 29-year-old Rakan Karwan. She told him she was being blackmailed and asked for help and protection. Rakan had no idea Masacre's mom was involved and that the blackmail was actually directed at her. He agreed to act as a mediator between Saqib and his friend. After meeting the guy, Rakan found out that Saqib first wanted £5,000 to leave the Bukhari family alone. The blackmailer claimed he had spent that much while they were on good terms and wanted cash back. Now Masacre and her friends faced a difficult choice of how to deal with Saqib without getting into trouble themselves. After long discussions, they chose the car method. They contacted the extortionist and arranged a meeting in a Tesco supermarket car park, promising to bring the full amount. The meeting was set for 1:30 a.m., when the car park would be empty. The supermarket was roughly halfway between the cities where the former lovers lived. Saqib agreed. The only thing he didn't know was that not only the Bukhari women were coming to the meeting, but several other people as well. On 11th February 2022, Masacre, Ansreen, Rakan, and 5 more friends split into 2 cars and drove to the empty supermarket car park. They deliberately parked the cars at a distance from each other to have room for maneuver. At first, not all the friends knew why they were there. Rakan and another friend got out and disappeared from sight to create the impression that the women had come alone. Most likely, they planned to jump Saqib right there in the car park, but there were several things they couldn't foresee. First of all, the guy didn't come alone. Saqib hated driving, so he talked to his friends. No one wanted to drive to another city in the middle of the night, and he was already about to cancel. But one of his good friends, Hashim Ijazuddin, agreed to keep Saqib company. He was the kind who was always ready to help. Only Hashim didn't know his friend was blackmailing anyone. He thought it would be fun to drive on the night highway, listen to music, and chat. Hashim and Saqib arrived at the car park a little early and somehow sensed something was wrong, that Ansreen and Mahek were setting them up. They didn't even stop or get out to avoid a physical confrontation. They just did a lap and drove back onto the motorway. Immediately, a blue Seat Leon pulled in behind them, followed by the Bukhari's Audi. During the chase, Mahek called Saqib from her mother's phone and told him what she was going to do to him. At 1:20 a.m., a petrol station camera recorded 3 cars racing down the road. From the side, it looked like the blue sedan was chasing Hashim's silver Skoda, and the Audi was chasing the blue sedan. They were going about 160 kilometers per hour, and it looked extremely dangerous. Right after the call from Mahek, Saqib dialed 999 and reported that their car was being pursued. He tried to explain to the operator that 2 cars were chasing them and trying to block them on the road. The operator told Saqib to head to the nearest police station immediately, but unfortunately, the guys had no such opportunity. From the transcript, it seemed the dispatcher didn't believe Saqib. She asked why he thought they were being chased. The terrified guy said the people behind them were wearing balaclavas, masks with eye slits. He feared for his life and the life of his friend Hashim, who was driving, but couldn't give their exact location. The emergency operator kept asking questions when the blue sedan rammed the back of the Skoda and the Audi pinned them from the side. Then there was a crash, and the line went dead. At 1:30 a.m., Hashim and Saqib's car was forced off the road at full speed, hit the central barrier, flipped over it, smashed into a tree, split in half, and burst into flames instantly. The other 2 cars continued down the motorway before stopping at the next lay-by. CCTV captured 2 people getting out, checking the cars for damage, then getting back in and driving off in the opposite direction. All 8 people watched from their windows as a huge fire raged at the crash site, but not one of them thought to call emergency services to try to save the young men burning alive. It later emerged that Ansreen collapsed on the seat, sobbing uncontrollably, while Mahek tried to comfort her. The blue sedan and Audi parked in a nearby area. All passengers got out, and 7 of them went for a walk around the streets, supposedly to get some night air after a heavy dinner. The walk lasted about an hour. One person, Mohammed, went straight home. The others coordinated their cover story in case the police called them. Then they returned to the cars and drove home. Meanwhile, the fire burned so fiercely that firefighters couldn't put it out immediately. When they finally got close enough to the burned-out car, they saw 2 bodies inside, Saqib Hussein and Hashim Ijazuddin. Their lives ended at just 21 years old. It was stated that they both died as a result of the car hitting several obstacles. The impact was truly serious. The car split in 2 and the engine flew off to the side. So saving the guys before the fire started would have been impossible anyway. Investigators quickly established the car hadn't crashed on its own. They checked nearby CCTV and learned about Saqib's 999 call. The footage showed 2 cars chasing the silver Skoda with Saqib and Hashim inside at high speed. The vehicles were immediately identified and tracked via the automatic number plate recognition system. The Bukhari women hadn't even returned home when police were already at their door. The Audi involved in the chase and Mahek's call to Saqib's phone during the pursuit led officers straight to the address. The door was opened by Mahek's teenage brother. Before he could react, he was told he was under arrest for the murder of 2 people. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night in pajamas, opening the door, and before your eyes adjust, being arrested. It's impossible to tell if it's a nightmare or harsh reality. The boy naturally panicked, but hearing about the car crash started proving to police that he didn't even have a driving license and had spent the night at home. Officers quickly realized they had the wrong person, apologized for the mistake, and let him go. Just as he exhaled and relaxed, he was hit with another bombshell. The car crash had been caused by his mother and sister. The fact was that his mother's phone number was registered in her son's name. Later that day, 11th February 2022, the authorities appeared again at the Bukhari residence to question Mahek and Ansreen. Both women were in pajamas and looked very calm. Mahek told investigators a completely fabricated story about where she had been that night. The girl really had been among the first to witness the strange chase. Moreover, she had almost been affected by their actions on the road. Mahek described the events as if recounting the most ordinary parking situation somewhere in the city center. She looked very composed and sincerely convinced in her words. With gestures, she showed how the cars had been moving on the motorway. The only difference from the real picture in Mahek's story was that she and her mom had been bystanders. According to the girl, she and Ansreen were driving in their own Audi when suddenly the car in front of them started accelerating and then crashed into the barrier. Mahek had no idea who was in that car because she always kept her distance from other vehicles. She also mentioned the blue car and said she got the impression that these two cars were in some kind of survival race. The blue sedan was slightly to the left, and the girl had to constantly slow down so as not to get caught up in the racer's maneuvers. Mom advised Mahek to stay away from their moves, but it wasn't always possible. Unfortunately, Miss Bukhari noticed neither the registration plate nor any distinctive features. She couldn't even name the make of the car. When the crash happened, Mahek supposedly saw the blue sedan stop, so she herself continued on her way. Ansreen convinced her that the drivers might be drunk and it was unsafe to stop near them, so Mahek drove on. In reality, the TikToker's behavior during questioning told a lot about her character. She was the type people say will walk over corpses just to achieve her goals. Mahek was calm and confident in her own story. She pretended not to know who was driving the blue sedan and thought it would work. Police simply let Mahek talk everything that came to her mind. They knew the girl was digging herself deeper into her own lies. From the very beginning, the motive of the crime was quite clear. Saqib's relatives told officers that he had been in a relationship with an older woman he affectionately called Anzi. He had even introduced her to his sister. But mother and daughter denied any connection to the deceased guy. Ansreen had deleted all records and photos proving their affair from her phone. But detectives were able to access Saqib's cloud albums where every photo and every video was filled with love or whatever was between them. Investigators also discovered call logs showing constant contact between the drivers of the blue sedan and the Audi on the night of the disaster, and they traced the call to Saqib that came from Mahek right before the crash. Events developed rapidly. All 8 people who had been in the 2 above-mentioned cars that night were detained. 7 of them remained in custody. The blue sedan was driven by 22-year-old Rais Jamal. It also carried 22-year-old Natasha Akhtar, 22-year-old Sanav Gula Mustafa, and 27-year-old Amir Jamal. In the Audi were 45-year-old Ansreen Bukhari, 23-year-old Mahek Bukhari, and 21-year-old Mohammed Patel. The Audi was driven by 29-year-old Rekhan Karwan. They were all charged with a serious crime that took the lives of 2 young people, and all of them unanimously denied involvement in the crash. All the passengers and driver of the blue sedan assured officers that they were on their way to a friend's house to play Monopoly. They did see something burning on the roadside, but it had nothing to do with them. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mahek also continued to stick to her own version, but after some time decided to change tactics and admitted that her mom really had had an affair. Everything had been fine until Saqib started threatening to show up at the Bukhari house and tell her father everything. Mahek just wanted to protect her mom. That night they were going to give the ex-lover money so he would stop bothering them. To avoid going alone to another city, she asked her friend to escort them. The girl was worried that her mother's ex-lover might attack them. Mahek and Ansrin were going to have a serious talk with Saqib and convince him to leave the family alone. As for the blue sedan full of other people, Mahek barely knew any of them because they were Rakan's friends. She thought the guy had invited them just in case as backup. It never even crossed Mahek's mind what the people in the blue car were planning. The girl tried in every way to convince police that this time she wasn't lying. She said the only reason she had lied was that she was ashamed of her mom's affair with a young guy and didn't want it to appear in the news. In the end, Mahek even tried to convince investigators that Saqib wanted to die himself and deliberately made Hashim crash the car. Officers were shocked by the stories the pretty young girl spun in the interview room. They asked directly whether Saqib, wanting suicide, decided to take his best friend with him to the next world, and Mahek nodded affirmatively. The authorities didn't believe her, and all the participants were brought to trial. Only one of the 8 managed to walk free. The first trial was complete chaos. 7 people sat on the dock. Most of them had their own versions of the events of that night, slightly or completely different from each other. Prosecutors decided to split all the defendants into groups. The trial of Mahek and Ansrain Bukhari and the 2 car drivers was decided to be held separately from the rest of the friends who were in the cars. They might simply not have known the plan and had no way to influence the situation. Having gone out with friends, they unwittingly got into trouble that ended very tragically. What can you do at 160 kilometers per hour? And that is not a statement, just an assumption that still had to be figured out. Another complication in the case was the victims themselves. Cannabis was found in Hashim's blood during the autopsy, and he was driving at high speed. Defense lawyers immediately latched onto this detail and tried to shift all the blame onto the victims who supposedly provoked the crash themselves. Then Saqib also came under fire. It turned out Ansrin was not the only woman Saqib had threatened when she tried to leave him. A witness in no way connected to the defendants testified, so it didn't seem she had a motive to lie for them. The woman said she met Saqib at a party in a club. He begged for her phone number. At the time, she already had a boyfriend, but she gave the number to the stranger just to get rid of him. In the end, Saqib started flooding her with messages. He also called 15 to 20 times a day, threatening to smash her car or come to her house. The woman contacted local police 3 times because she was terrified of the new acquaintance. Overall, this information painted Saqib in a very bad light. The jury was also shown text messages the guy sent Ansrain threatening to send explicit photos and videos to the Bukhari family and post them online if the woman didn't pick up and talk to him. It all sounded quite frightening. However, the messages were taken out of context, and it was unknown what exactly provoked those threats. Was it banal blackmail, or did Saqib simply not know what to do with his rejected feelings? Unfortunately, only the young man himself could give a reliable answer, but his life, alas, had tragically ended. Any trial is very hard for the victim's family and friends. It was especially difficult for Hashim's parents, who had nothing to do with the whole thing. The young man only got behind the wheel for his friend and drove to another city at night at his request, where he ended up meeting his own death. And now his loved ones had to listen to their son being accused of smoking weed. But most of all, internet users sympathized with the Bukhari husband and son, because during the trial, the family essentially fell apart. Ansrin's husband did not visit her while she was in custody, but still appeared at some stages of the proceedings. Though perhaps he only wanted to support his daughter. For Mr. Bukhari, the worst thing was that the case became public. During the hearings, not only his wife's affair with 21-year-old Saqib was discussed. Information about Ansrin's first infidelity was also made public. The prosecution stated that, in their opinion, Mahek, her mother, and friend Rakan had planned together how to get rid of Saqib. These 3 were the main masterminds of the crime. and it was they who lured the guy to that car park in another city, supposedly to hand over money. Whether they wanted to attack him there or had already decided to stage a crash on the road, the result would have been the same: threat to life. Chasing a car at 160 kilometers per hour and trying to force it off the road can only be done with specific intentions. The defense of Ansrain and her daughter Mahek was madness in its essence. Lawyers assured that these women had become victims of a crazy stalker. Mother and daughter only wanted to talk to Saqib that night, and nothing more. And although they had made several questionable wrong decisions, Saqib was to blame for instilling terror in them. The Bukharis simply had no other choice. Out of 8 people, only 7 were arrested. 21-year-old Mohammed Patel, who was in the Audi, left the company immediately after the crash. He was the main witness. For some reason, he was released. Some internet users believe he is innocent. Others say he was released because he cooperated with police. Either way, the guy confirmed the story that matched the transcript of Saqib's 999 call. Mohammed said Saqib really was being chased at high speed. All participants were wearing balaclavas, so cameras wouldn't capture their faces. Rakan called the driver of the blue sedan and asked him to ram the Skoda from behind. The guy said he was the last to join the group and had no idea what the others were planning and what he had gotten into. He was terrified by what was happening and fled as soon as the opportunity arose. Whether that was really the case is unknown, but his testimony greatly helped the investigation. The remaining 5, apart from Ansreen, Mahek, and Mohammed, insisted they had done nothing and knew nothing. They were just going for a drive and then to play Monopoly. Each participant in this wild chase had personal arguments in their defense. Rais Jamal, who was driving the blue sedan, said he just wanted to scare the guys in the Skoda because one of them was blackmailing the women, but the chase got out of control. Amir Jamal, a passenger in the blue car, said he was high and didn't understand what was happening. Natasha Akhtar assured that she was in love with the driver, so she didn't want to anger him with comments about dangerous driving. According to her, all boys drive like crazy. In the future, the girl planned to become a criminal defense lawyer, so getting jailed didn't fit into her plans. Sanav Gula Mustafa, also a passenger in the blue car, explained that his father was dying of cancer and he was the only one caring for him. The sick man could no longer eat, drink, or even use the toilet without help. Sanav said he would never risk leaving his father without help for some barely known women. The guy spent whole days caring for his sick father and went out just to get some air and change the oppressive atmosphere. In the end, when his father died, the son couldn't even attend the funeral. Discussions about the degree to which all these people were involved in the deaths of 2 young guys continue to this day. But the fact remains, they participated in this deadly chase wearing balaclavas. Perhaps they thought it was all a fun game, thrills, and saw nothing terrible in it. However, being in the pursuer's car automatically made them participants in the crime. After several hearings, the jury retired from the courtroom. They deliberated for more than 28 hours and finally returned with the verdict. Ansran Bukhari, her daughter Mahek Bukhari, the driver of the blue sedan Rais Jamal, and the driver of the Audi Rekan Karwan were found guilty of the murder of Hashim and Saqib. Mahek was sentenced to life imprisonment and must serve at least 31 years and 8 months in prison before applying for parole. Ansreen was sentenced to life imprisonment and at least 26 years and 9 months of imprisonment. Rais and Rikan also received life sentences. Rais must serve a minimum of 27 years. He had extra added for driving without a license. And Rikan will spend 26 years and 10 months behind bars without the right to parole. Sanav, Amir, and Natasha were found guilty of manslaughter. They received from 11 to 15 years. Mohammed was not charged. Because of the reckless actions of one adult woman who succumbed to the charm of youth and plunged into the power of love fantasies, several people suffered. Saqib Hussain was far from a perfect person and really behaved inappropriately, but his behavior definitely did not deserve death. It is incredibly stupid and monstrous to take someone's life just to hide your own mistake. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Susan and John met on a blind date, built a wonderful family, and raised 2 children. Did the man know that one day he would experience in real life what it truly means to meet someone blind? Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The heartbreaking events we're going to talk about today took place in a city called Coral Gables, located about 11 kilometers from Miami. Coral Gables is an affluent part of South Florida, a beautiful place with lush green avenues winding through residential neighborhoods, historic landmarks, and world-class restaurants. There are wide roads, tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, Mediterranean revival architecture, countless stunning plazas, and fountains throughout the city. It was in this unique place that the Sutton family lived. Susan Marrier met John Sutton back in 1974 on a blind date. It was love at first sight. Everything developed quickly, and within a year, Susan became Mrs. Sutton. They shared very similar upbringings. John's father worked for a manufacturing company. The family lived in a Pittsburgh suburb in Pennsylvania. They had a nice house with a large backyard and a swimming pool. As a child, John never lacked for anything and was determined to create the same kind of life for his future family. Susan was a very beautiful woman. In her senior year of high school, she was prom queen. She later graduated from college and worked as a nurse in a surgical intensive care unit. That profession required certain qualities. Not everyone can work in the high-pressure environment of an operating room, where you have to control your emotions, see death up close, and then help patients relearn how to live. Susan was hardworking and deeply dedicated to her work. John was also successful. He graduated from the University of Miami School of Law, became an attorney, and quickly climbed the career ladder. So both spouses' careers were on the right track. The next step after the wedding was having children. The couple had everything one could dream of: financial stability, good health, and a wonderful relationship. Susan planned to get pregnant immediately after the wedding. She expected it to happen quickly since they were both young and healthy. But after several unsuccessful attempts, the Suttons received devastating news. Susan was infertile. The news of infertility is a difficult situation to go through. It either brings a couple closer and strengthens their bond, or it drives husband and wife apart. When one partner dreams of having children and the other cannot for some reason, a choice has to be made. Despite the serious trials, John and Susan stayed together and were determined to try everything to make their dream of a child come true. They consulted a reproductive specialist, and the woman began regular treatment. The couple had high hopes, but after several years of failed attempts to conceive, Susan opened her mind and heart to adopting a baby. Even if the child wasn't biologically theirs and John's, they could still give him or her so much. By that time, Susan was working as a senior nurse in the surgical ICU, and John had reached unprecedented heights in the legal field. He had even received an award given by fellow attorneys for outstanding achievement in law, high professional skill in jurisprudence, and excellent communication abilities. In April 1979, the Suttons were given the opportunity to adopt a beautiful baby boy just days after his birth. The baby hadn't even entered the world yet, but a loving family was already waiting for him. Every adoptive parent dreams of adopting a newborn, believing they can raise the child as their own. The Suttons were no exception. Chris was born on April 13, 1979, and it became the happiest day of the couple's life. They cherished every minute spent with him. Both John and Susan wanted to give this boy everything. They adored Chris. Happy and carefree, he ran around their big house, laughing and playing. He had a sea of toys. On vacations, his parents took him with them. Chris was loved beyond measure, and he returned that love to his father and mother. As the only child, he received all possible attention and was excessively spoiled. Susan even quit her job to stay home with Chris. Everything was simply perfect. But 7 years later, the Suttons felt they wanted to expand their family and thought about adoption again. They wanted to give Chris a little sister and themselves a daughter. Having had such a wonderful experience, they believed they could give their love and support to another child. In the end, they adopted a beautiful little girl named Melissa. Finally, they felt they had a complete family of 4. Chris coped well with the role of big brother. He loved Melissa very much, and they were quite close. The parents didn't want to hide anything from their children, so eventually they told Chris and Melissa that they were adopted. It changed nothing in the Sutton family. Although the children were not biologically related, they grew up side by side. The older brother always stood up for his little sister when someone teased her at school or caused her trouble. Susan and John wanted to give their children the very best because they themselves had grown up in comfort and dreamed of doing the same for their kids. Some might call it indulging whims, but the parents saw it as an expression of love. When Chris grew older, his mother and father continued to pay for his apartment and car until he could stand on his own feet. That's how the Sutton family appeared from the outside. But very soon, everything would change. Something incredible, utterly shocking and unexpected would happen. The life of this ideal family would be turned upside down. Happiness would turn into devastation. By 2004, the Suttons were living in a beautiful waterfront home in Coral Gables. They were considered a highly influential couple in Miami and were known and respected in their community. John's law firm was thriving. By then, he had practiced law for 20 years and wanted to keep the business in the family. That's why Susan took on all the administrative duties of office manager, including bookkeeping. Melissa was 18 and had started college to study law so she could become an attorney too. 25-year-old Chris was engaged to a girl named Juliet Driscoll, who answered phones at the law firm. Chris helped however he could. He worked on cases, did research, performed various office tasks, made bank deposits, and tried to be useful in every way. Chris and Juliet met while the Suttons were on a family cruise. John owned 3 yachts, and they often took trips to the Caribbean or the Bahamas, where they scuba dived and fished. Juliet learned everything from Susan, who took the girl under her wing. Working side by side with John was his longtime colleague and friend, Teddy Montoto. He was one of the people the Suttons trusted most. Together, they were really successful, so John eventually offered Teddy a partnership in the firm. John handled litigation against various companies, representing other corporations. Their cases involved big money. The last case they won brought the firm 3 major victories. Each award was over $1 million. The partners planned to celebrate the successful conclusion of the cases and decided to combine the celebration with Susan's birthday on August 20th. She turned 57, and 2 days later they held a dinner party. Melissa had just started college, so she couldn't attend. At the table were Mr. and Mrs. Sutton, their son Chris with Juliet, and John's law partner Teddy Montoto. Melissa called to congratulate her mom once more, saying she missed her and hoped the party would be wonderful. It was a lovely dinner among close people. Everyone drank a little wine, ate a piece of birthday cake, and chatted about future plans. No one knew how this pleasant day would actually end. As the party wound down, the hosts turned on the TV and watched the Olympics with their guests for a while. It was getting late. Chris and Juliet planned to catch a movie, so around 9:30 p.m., they got ready to leave. 15 minutes later, family friend Teddy also said goodnight to the hosts and went home. John went to the bedroom to watch a bit more TV. Susan was finishing up some chores around the house so she could go to bed too. Because John snored very loudly, his wife slept in their son's former room across the hall from the master bedroom. She couldn't get proper rest in the same room with John. Before falling asleep, she was talking on the phone with a close friend. At some point, John thought he heard a door slam downstairs or something heavy fall to the ground. He didn't even have time to figure out what it was when suddenly the door to his bedroom burst open and someone dressed in black entered and pointed a gun at John. All Sutton could hear were repeated bangs again and again. He desperately rushed around the room trying to hide from the shots, but 4 bullets hit their target. The room was a mess. One bullet went through the headboard, another shattered a mirror. John fell to the floor bleeding but still breathing. Then the intruder left the room and headed to where Susan was sleeping. The wounded man could do nothing. He lay helplessly, listening as shots rang out one after another. Then the gunman returned to John and finished him off with 2 shots to the head. John's world went dark, but amazingly, he was still alive. The homeowner passed out, but at some point regained consciousness. He didn't know how Susan was, whether she was injured or what exactly had happened, but he realized he somehow had to reach a phone and call for help. John managed to open his eyes but saw nothing. The man knew his house layout very well and somehow, in the dark, stumbling and on the verge of death, managed to reach a phone and dial 911. He did everything he could to protect his family, his wife, and himself. Only a surge of adrenaline allowed him to get up despite the severity of his wounds. John even managed to open the front door and let the police in. Sutton was in critical condition, so he was rushed to Miami's trauma center. When examined, injuries were found everywhere, on his arms, face, and body. Blood flowed from his head and down. Doctors hurried to save his life, though they weren't sure they could. Meanwhile, police tried to find clues in the Sutton home and determine how the intruder had entered. The sliding glass door to the patio leading to the pool was open. It's possible the perpetrator entered through it. Detectives didn't know if it had been scratched earlier or if it happened during the break-in. Other officers walked down the long hallway to the bedrooms, checking room by room to make sure everything was okay. It was a fairly large house, and first they had to ensure the perpetrator had left and wasn't hiding somewhere. On the floor, police saw shell casings, broken glass, and blood. They still hadn't found Susan. She wasn't in the bedroom. Detectives noticed items lying on the dresser: wallet, money, other jewelry. Everything was untouched. If there had been a home invasion, it clearly wasn't for robbery. When officers approached Susan's bed, they saw a pile of blankets with bullet holes in them. After pulling back the covers, a heartbreaking scene appeared. The dead woman was still clutching the corners of the blankets over her head, as if trying to hide or block the bullets, but unfortunately, it hadn't saved her life. She lay on her back, and next to her was a bloody phone. Susan's face was severely damaged. There was a huge wound in the lower part. One eye had almost fallen out of its socket. Her forearm was so damaged that bone was visible. Even more shots had hit her torso. Police, frankly, couldn't understand who could have done this in an upscale neighborhood where violent crime was almost non-existent. Why had this family been targeted? Everything looked as if someone had deliberately come to this house with the firm intention of taking the Suttons' lives. While Susan's body was being transported to the coroner's office for autopsy, John faced emergency surgery. Doctors counted 6 bullet wounds on his body. 2 shots hit the head. 1 bullet entered the right temple and exited through the lower jaw. He also lost the tip of his ring finger and had his right thumb shot through. Another bullet was lodged somewhere in his chest. Detectives examining the house initially theorized that John had planned to harm Susan and then turned the gun on himself to deflect suspicion. He was a lawyer and knew how to stage it best. At that point, they still didn't know the man's true condition. That theory was quickly dismissed when doctors gave their conclusion. Sutton's head wounds were so severe that it was clear no sane person would shoot themselves in the temple just to fake an attack. The Suttons' younger daughter, Melissa, had no idea tragedy had struck her parents. It was her first day of college. She was starting classes while her father clung to life and her mother lay in the morgue. A friend called Melissa to offer condolences. That's how the girl learned in the most horrific way what tragedy had unfolded in her home. She frantically started calling her brother, then family friend Teddy, but no one answered. Only after some time did Teddy Montoto call Melissa back and then come pick her up to drive her to Miami to the hospital where her father was. Later that morning, Chris arrived at the scene. He saw police cars in front of his parents' house and couldn't understand what had happened. The young man approached one of the officers and explained who he was. He was then told the devastating news that his mother was dead and his father was in critical condition in the hospital. The young man was so shocked he couldn't hold back his emotions. After all, just yesterday they had celebrated Mom's birthday, and today she was gone. Tears welled up in Chris's eyes, and he rushed to the hospital to be with his father. The news about John was also grim. Doctors said the surgery had lasted 14 hours, but they had been unable to save John's eyesight. The damage to his head was too great. Unfortunately, he would never see sunlight again, and most likely would never be able to practice law or live the life he once had. The children sat by their father's bedside, talking to him to let him know they were there, but they had no idea how to tell him the news about the mother with whom he had lived for 29 years. John was in a medically induced coma. In the following weeks, the man slowly began to regain consciousness. One day, he even managed to say a few words. The first thing he asked was how Susan was doing. Melissa couldn't tell him the truth because John's life depended directly on his psychological state. Stress could kill him. Through tears, the girl lied to her father, saying Mom wasn't doing as well as he was. It was incredibly hard to hide the truth and give John false hope, but from a medical standpoint, it was vital for his survival. Investigators visited John every day, waiting for him to speak and hoping to learn details of the attack. But because the victim was on heavy medication, that opportunity didn't come for a long time. Meanwhile, they interviewed family and friends, as well as employees of John's firm, trying to figure out who could be behind this horrific crime. A lawyer could have serious enemies. Juliet, Chris's fiancée, recalled that John had recently won a case for a client, causing the client's ex-wife to lose a significant amount of money. Bailiffs came to her office and seized everything. This happened just days before the attack. The enraged woman had threatened Sutton's life. She stormed into John's firm and said she would get a gun and shoot him herself. Several people witnessed this heated exchange. Another piece supporting this theory came from a neighbor who heard the sound of a motorboat that night. The waterway ran right behind the houses. That night, no one heard or saw a car in front of the homes. It also happened that the woman who threatened Sutton owned a boat docked not far from John's house. However, this lead was also dropped because the suspect had a solid alibi. On the night of the attack, the woman was out of state, and a surveillance camera on her boat confirmed the vessel never left the dock. Detectives had to move on and keep looking for clues. Over the next few weeks, John drifted in and out of consciousness. Family and friends stayed by his side constantly, waiting for their father to fully regain consciousness so they could finally take him home. What surprised police most was how few clues there were at the crime scene. There were no fingerprints on the sliding glass door the intruder used to enter. The casings found in the hallway were from a 9mm pistol, but the murder weapon itself was missing. Investigators were also interested in whom Susan might have been talking to before her death and whether her caller had heard anything. Detectives went back to the reports from the night of the crime, hoping to find something. They learned that police had seen Teddy Montoto near the house. Moreover, he arrived before emergency services. Could the perpetrator have returned to the scene? How did Teddy know something had happened at the Suttons' house? Could he have deliberately left the door open that evening so he could slip in unnoticed at night and finish off the owners? Montoto was brought in for questioning, and the man told his version of that night's events. It turned out he was the one Susan had been talking to before bed. That looked suspicious. What could a married woman be discussing with her husband's business partner at that hour? Teddy assured officers their relationship was more than just professional. The Suttons were like family to him, and he and Susan were very close. During the phone call, Montoto suddenly heard a loud bang that sounded like a gunshot. Then the line went dead. He tried calling back, but no one answered. Fearing something serious had happened to Susan, he got dressed and drove to their house to check if everything was okay. Police were not convinced by this story. Investigators asked Melissa Sutton about family relationships, and the girl confirmed that Teddy was like a godfather to them. She and Mom could discuss work issues from morning till night. That was normal. Still, something in Montoto's story didn't add up. The man admitted he carried a 9mm firearm. The gun was taken for testing since it matched the caliber of the crime weapon. Moreover, Teddy said he had been target shooting the day before, so gunshot residue could be on his hands and clothes. With this statement, he further turned detectives against himself. An experienced shooter could easily hit a moving target like John. Teddy also had motive, money, means, and opportunity to eliminate his partner and take sole control of the firm. The Sutton family friend was asked to take a polygraph test, and he agreed. His gun was sent for forensic examination to see if the casings matched those found at the scene. The lie detector showed Montoto was lying. He had not told the truth about his relationship with Susan. The man had no choice but to confess that they were connected by more than friendship. However, Teddy did have an alibi. His cell phone location showed he was at home during the call with Susan. The casings from his pistol also did not match the crime weapon, and another viable lead fell through. As soon as Melissa and Chris realized the perpetrator could be someone close or a client whose case had gone badly, they became afraid the killer would return to finish the job. Chris begged at the hospital to use a fake name for his father and not let anyone into his room. Investigators also exercised due caution and checked every family member's alibi. Melissa was at college about 5 hours away, and Chris had been at the movies with Juliet. He even had the ticket stub. Detectives went to the theater and reviewed surveillance footage that confirmed the young couple had indeed been at the movies at the time of the crime. By early September, John had recovered from several life-saving surgeries and dreamed of going home soon. That desire instantly vanished when he was finally told the devastating news about Susan. He simply couldn't believe it. He had lived all this time thinking he would soon see his wife again. John sat on the bed, helpless, completely blind, and having just lost the love of his life. His children's hearts broke just looking at him, and a little later he had to learn another bitter truth. Susan had been having an affair with Steady. Returning to the house where the tragedy occurred was beyond John's strength, so Chris and Juliet invited him to stay at their townhouse nearby. After all, it was a house that belonged to John. Chris had the chance to repay his father's kindness. During the day, a staff nurse cared for John, and Chris and Juliet helped with errands and drove him to doctor appointments. Months passed, Christmas came, and still no arrest had been made. John did the unthinkable. He returned to work. He conducted hearings, dove back into cases, and revived his law firm. The man used work to distract himself and recover emotionally. John refused to remain in a state of hopelessness and self-pity, but everything was far from rosy. Strange things began happening to John. While on vacation, Melissa got behind the wheel of her father's car to drive him to the doctor and nearly caused an accident. It turned out all the lug nuts on the left front wheel had been deliberately loosened. When the man returned to his own house and began slowly adjusting to living alone, the strange events continued. At any time of day or night, for no reason, the alarm system would go off. Imagine the panic of a blind, lonely man when fear for his life completely consumes him. And this could happen several times a day. John called repairmen, but it turned out all the wires had been cut. They fixed the wiring, and the next day it happened again. It was perfectly clear that someone intended to drive Sutton to his grave or scare him half to death. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Detectives questioned every client at John's firm who had lost a case. Everyone had an alibi. Of course, in 20 years of practice, an attorney had been threatened with violence more than once, but there was no evidence anyone had followed through. Police had nothing but stacks of documents, crime scene photos, potential suspects, and polygraph results. They reviewed the case files over and over, trying to find something they might have missed. Finally, Another breakthrough occurred. An arrest was made in a case completely unrelated to the Coral Gables attack. A man named Garrett Kopp had threatened two guys with a firearm. This happened 50 kilometers from the Sutton residence. During the investigation, it turned out that the attacker's pistol was also the murder weapon in the John and Susan case. But who was Garrett? Why would he want to harm a lawyer's family? The arrested man said he had bought the gun on the street from a stranger. That could well have been true, if not for one strange coincidence. Garrett had previously been to the Sutton home doing various odd jobs, and he had been hired by none other than Chris, John, and Susan's son. It turned out the two were very close. The guys met when Chris and his fiancée moved into the same complex where Garrett's family lived. Kopp had been to Chris's parents' house many times and helped around the house. The young man had no steady job and desperately needed money, so Chris hired him whenever possible. A friendship developed between them. However, detectives found this friendship suspiciously close. Not every pair of friends calls each other 300 times a month, especially since Garrett had a reason to want the Suttons dead. He might have envied what they had, envied their perfect family relationships or something else. Surely the guy wouldn't have pulled off this crime alone. And then investigators turned their attention to Chris Sutton. On the day of the attack, Chris and Garrett had called each other 13 times. The last call came right after the movie ended, at the exact moment when Susan was already dead and John was in critical condition. Another red flag was how Chris reacted to the news of the tragedy at the family home. He was visibly upset, but at the same time pulled the movie ticket stub from his pocket and handed it to the officer, though no one had asked for it. You have to admit, it's strange to immediately proclaim your alibi when you've just been told your mother is dead and your father is gravely injured. At first, detectives didn't pay attention to it, but in light of new events, everything looked completely different. Now it was time to hear about Chris from people who knew him best, people who knew his family and friends. After hearing these accounts, investigators realized they were on the right track. It's impossible to imagine what went on behind the closed doors of the Sutton home. All that is known is how desperately the couple wanted a child, how overjoyed they were to adopt Chris, how they loved that little boy. But as it turned out, Chris was no angel. By age 13, his behavior began to change. He started doing poorly in school and stopped doing homework. Susan and John thought they just needed to get through this teenage phase and everything would work itself out. But it didn't. Over time, things only got worse, and more behavioral problems appeared. The teenager was expelled from schools his parents transferred him to. At home, his anger and aggression came out even more. He damaged walls and broke things. Chris even attacked Susan several times, trying to choke her. The Suttons sought help, wanting expert opinions from psychologists, psychiatrists, and pediatricians. Doctors diagnosed him with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. One specialist said the boy had oppositional defiant disorder, when a child refuses to cooperate and is hostile toward peers, parents, teachers, and authority figures. The disorder is characterized by frequent tantrums, arguments, and irritability. This type of behavior develops when a child throws tantrums and instead of punishment receives sympathy, so he keeps trying to get attention that way. The Suttons worried about their son and tried different treatments, from cognitive behavioral therapy to medication. Nothing helped. Once Christopher and two friends caused $50,000 worth of damage to a teacher's house, spray painting walls and destroying all the furniture. The last straw was when the teenager took John's .22 caliber rifle, walked into the living room, and pointed it straight at Susan and Melissa. It wasn't loaded, but mother and sister didn't know that and were terrified. Instead of punishing his son, John sent him to his room. At 16, everything got even worse. Susan found a letter from Chris detailing how he wanted to kill his parents for the inheritance. Naturally, the boy claimed it was a joke, but it was another alarming sign. The parents truly didn't believe their son was capable of taking their lives or harming them. But when he got involved with drugs, they realized drastic measures were needed. One doctor confirmed that Chris was developing psychopathic tendencies, and this could lead to tragedy if action wasn't taken immediately. Susan and John researched places for troubled teens, boarding schools, shelters, treatment centers. They settled on a place called Paradise Cove. It had a program designed to help teenagers overcome behavioral problems, a kind of reform school. Paradise Cove was located in remote American Samoa in the South Pacific. It was a facility for boys that opened in the early 90s, but the methods used there were highly questionable. They first used intimidation tactics to instill fear in every student, gain control, and achieve obedience. Chris was 16 when huge guys burst into his room in the middle of the night, restrained him, and put him on a plane to that distant island. In effect, the parents had arranged a kidnapping. John, being a lawyer, obtained a restraining order against 16-year-old Christopher, followed by a court order to remove him for re-education. The Suttons were promised their son would follow an academic program and they would receive weekly progress reports. The parents thought they were sending their rebellious teenager to a beautiful paradise island with no temptations, where Chris could enjoy natural beauty and simplicity and learn not to take everything for granted. After completing the program, they would see a changed person who appreciated their care. Susan and John even visited the island before sending Chris there. They paid a huge sum for professionals to turn him into a normal person. But how wrong they were. Paradise existed only in the name and the natural beauty of the place. The people running the program were far from educators. They abused their power and physically harmed the boys. It was a real prison for troubled teens. The camp was unsanitary, scabies, lice, ringworm. Residents were humiliated physically and psychologically. For any infraction, they were put in solitary confinement, restrained hand and foot, and deprived of food. The owner himself denied the abuses at Paradise Cove. But subsequent lawsuits and investigations eventually led the Samoan government to shut the place down. When the Suttons were finally allowed to visit their son a year later, he looked stronger, fitter, and seemed happy to see his parents. Chris tried to tell them about the harsh conditions, but his parents thought he was manipulating them. The agreement was that he had to complete the program first before coming home. The Suttons saw their son having a great time playing volleyball, swimming in the ocean, and happy to see them, so they left Chris there for another year in that hell. They didn't believe his stories about the terrible living conditions. In the end, that was their mistake. In the Paradise Cove situation, one can understand Susan and John, who saw the reform school as the last chance to turn their wayward teenager into a normal person. They were driven only by love for their son, but they truly didn't know what Chris had gone through. The idea was to make the boys value normal life through strict, sometimes brutal conditions. The teens followed a rigid schedule, exercised, and were kept constantly busy. However, they couldn't take a single step without permission, even to shower or use the toilet. They had to pass 6 levels to complete the program. As they progressed, they earned more privileges. For example, at higher levels they could call home and talk to their parents. All education was left to the students themselves. They studied the material on their own because there were no certified teachers on the island. Chris Sutton spent 2.5 years at Paradise Cove. He was allowed to return home only the day after his 19th birthday. His lawyer father managed to arrange it. It seemed the young man had returned to a normal rhythm. He finished high school, matured, and became more restrained. As a gift, the whole family went on a cruise to the British Virgin Islands together. That's where the young man met Juliet. His mother and father hoped the girl would keep Chris in line. A year later, they bought the couple a place in Miami while Chris attended college. Juliet started working at John's law firm. Susan became a second mother to her son's fiancé. She taught her how to dress stylishly, do makeup, and choose jewelry. John also treated Chris's girlfriend very warmly and accepted her as family. Christopher had been a difficult teenager when he was sent to that awful island school. But many years had passed, and now accusing him of attacking his parents didn't seem entirely fair. Chris began returning to normal family life. For a while, everything really was fine, although, as it later turned out, he hadn't changed at all. Some people don't change, they only learn to adapt and deep down, never forgive. It seemed Chris had harbored a grudge against both adoptive parents and was waiting for the right moment to take revenge. When investigators asked John if his son could have been involved in the attack, the man immediately rejected the idea. Chris had been by his side the whole time, helping his blind father with chores and caring for him. Juliet, Chris's fiancée, also said her fiancé was completely dependent on his parents. Even though he was 25, his mother and father paid for his car and apartment and financed his studies, and Chris was very close to his parents. To sort this out, police arrested Garrett Kopp for the attempted murder of Susan and John and subjected him to intense interrogation. The guy denied everything. Then officers decided to talk to his ex-girlfriend, and she revealed that on the night of the attack, Garrett came home and burned his clothes. When she asked why, Kopp admitted he had been involved in the crime. Faced with the evidence, Garrett broke and confessed to shooting the Suttons. According to him, he and Chris had been using and selling drugs together and were involved in many illegal schemes to make money. Garrett blamed his friend for everything because now his fate depended on a deal with police. Christopher had never forgiven Susan and John for Paradise Cove. He wanted revenge on his parents and also to collect life insurance payouts on both of them. The young man promised his friend Garrett $100,000 if everything went smoothly. On March 26, 2005, a warrant was issued for Christopher Sutton's arrest, though there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime other than the word of Garrett Kopp, the man who pulled the trigger. Chris attempted to flee, but was stopped by police and jailed. The only person who could testify against Chris was his fiancée, Juliet Driscoll. Detectives convinced the girl to tell them whether her fiancé had ever talked about planning to kill his parents. Susan had been like a second mother to Juliet, so she had no right to cover for a criminal. Juliet Driscoll faced the hardest choice of her life: help bring justice for the woman who had done so much for her, or stay silent and help Christopher avoid prison. Juliet burst into tears and told detectives that Chris had been planning this for years. The guy could not forgive his father and mother for the 2.5 years of hell on the island. At that last dinner, Susan and her son had argued over car insurance. The mother said she was no longer going to finance Christopher and that it was time he earned money for his own whims. That completely enraged the young man. It's possible that was the moment he made the fateful decision. He called his friend Garrett and then left the sliding patio door unlocked. The trial began in July 2010. Chris had a very good lawyer, but he couldn't convince the jury of his client's innocence. Another witness was found whom Chris had asked to find a hitman for his parents. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The family had to relive all the painful moments from 5 years earlier. On July 22, 2010, the jury found Christopher Patrick Sutton guilty of the murder of his adoptive mother and the attempted murder of his adoptive father. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. John Sutton addressed the court, saying there were no winners in this case. He had lost Susan, had lost Christopher long before, had lost his eyesight. Everyone lost. His words became the finale of this story. At the moment, John's life has stabilized. Despite his blindness, he is back practicing law. His firm is thriving. He swims, skis, and jokes that he met his new girlfriend on a blind date. The man still hopes for a miracle and invests heavily in vision restoration research. Who knows, maybe one day he really will see his new life again. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. A driver was approaching Steve's Hill Cemetery when, from a distance, he noticed something strange on the road. He slowed down and saw that it was a little girl. She was completely alone, filthy, covered in something red, and there were no adults anywhere nearby. That was the moment the world learned of the Napier family tragedy. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The events of today's story took place in a tiny town called Laurel, Indiana, a god-forsaken place where the streets are lined with old, run-down houses and the sidewalks are cracked and uneven. Yet there's a sense of calm and peace here that's hard to find in big cities. Laurel is beautiful rural countryside, surrounded by hills, centuries-old forests, and clear creeks. An ideal spot to relax and enjoy the outdoors. Most residents of Laurel were born here, grew up here, and stayed for life. New people almost never showed up. The 2010 census recorded just 512 residents. Everyone was either related or had known each other since they were in diapers. They were friendly and welcoming, always ready to lend a hand. A very strong sense of community bound them together, since many families had lived there for generations. The downside was that finding work was extremely difficult. Many homes in Laurel were mobile homes because they were more affordable. Just outside town was an even more secluded area. Along Steve's Hill Road, a few houses were scattered far apart. Most were trailers and mobile homes. The people living in that part of town mostly raised livestock and farmed. The Napier family had long been part of Laurel's history, having lived there for generations. The Richardson family, who lived on the same street, was no different. Angela Richardson was born June 12, 1964. Both her mother and father had grown up in large families, so it was no surprise that they had 9 children of their own, 5 sons and 4 daughters. Everyone called Angela Angie. Her great-grandfather had settled in Laurel in the 1930s and died there in old age, leaving behind 6 children. That's how this big story began in a small town. Roy Darrell Napier was born December 12, 1960. His parents divorced, and he was raised by his mother Shirley and stepfather Albert Cummins. The Cummins family was another well-known name in Laurel. They farmed and owned a large piece of land. Roy's mother and stepfather were hard-working people who taught him from a young age to value discipline, work ethic, and loyalty. Roy Napier and Angie Richardson had known each other since childhood. Over time, their friendship turned into serious feelings, and in 1984, they married. Just 1 year later, in April 1985, their son Joshua was born. Now, they were a full-fledged Napier family. Angie and Roy worked hard to build a comfortable life for themselves and their little boy. Roy was quiet, but a hard worker. His main goal was to provide for his growing family. Angie and Roy both came from large families, so they always knew they would have at least 3 children. 3 years later, in April 1988, their daughter Melissa was born. Now there were 4 of them. Roy was a decent carpenter who had lately specialized in drywall installation. Since good jobs were scarce in Laurel, he took whatever work he could find. His attention to detail and responsibility made him a valued worker. Clients knew that if Roy took a job, it would be done perfectly and on time. In his free time, he watched TV. He was a die-hard football fan. Sometimes friends who were also fans would come over. They'd watch their favorite team together and then play poker. The problem with small towns is there's absolutely nothing to do, especially back then, before everyone had internet and social media. Those evenings with friends and family were the brightest moments in Roy's life and for the whole Napier family. In Laurel, they had plenty of relatives who were always ready to help. While Roy worked, Angie took care of Melissa and Joshua. Once the kids started school, she got a job as a waitress at a diner in the center of town. Later, she worked for a while in a hardware and paint store, contributing to the family budget. She also spent a lot of time tending the yard, loved cooking, and going mushroom hunting in the woods. In Laurel, mushroom hunts were a real event, a tradition. The season started in mid-April and lasted about a month. People went out very early in the morning to search for morels. For Laurel residents, it was practically a sport. These days, there's even a Facebook group where county maps are updated in real time showing where and when mushrooms are popping up. People proudly post photos of their best hauls. Angie and Roy were good people who worked hard, lived simply, and loved their family. 5 years after Melissa was born, in October 1993, another son, Jacob, arrived. Although a baby is always a joy, it's also another mouth to feed and clothe. By the time the kids were older, Roy and Angie were barely making ends meet. In 2004, when Joshua was 19, Melissa 16, and Jacob 11, Roy turned to his mother for help. Shirley owned a lot of land on Steve's Hill Road. Shirley Cummins helped Roy buy a trailer that they placed right next to her house. That way they were closer to her, and she could help more often with the kids. At the same time, the Nepiers didn't have to worry about rent or buying a house. Shirley was happy to help her son. She loved him and Angie, whom she'd known since childhood, and enjoyed spending time with her grandchildren. Even with his mother's help, Roy and Angie still had to work hard just to stay afloat. Roy had suffered multiple injuries on the job. His back constantly hurt, and he needed regular treatment. Eventually, the damage to his health became so severe that he could no longer work. Roy was declared disabled and spent the last years on painkillers. The 5 of them lived in a small trailer in the middle of fields, but they remained optimistic and never gave up. The kids first attended the only elementary school in Laurel, a 15-minute walk along dirt roads. Then they moved to the middle high school in Brookville, about a 30-minute drive from Laurel. The children grew older, and so did their needs. Living in a cramped trailer with no money caused a lot of arguments. The situation weighed heavily on Roy, the head of the household. He and Angie began fighting frequently. At one point, Angie decided to move out. She rented another trailer a little farther down the road. She wanted her own space, but she still came to Roy and the kids almost every day. The 2 trailers were only a few minutes' walk apart. The Nepier kids did everything they could to help their parents. Youngest son, Jacob, worked on a farm baling hay. Oldest son, Joshua, also did various chores around the house. The young man was ambitious and wanted the family to achieve financial stability. He tried to help Roy and take full control of the situation. Melissa was studying hard at the time, dreaming of becoming a certified nurse, and spent a lot of time with her boyfriend Lucas. She hoped one day to build a career and leave Laurel, or at least leave the trailer where she currently lived with her father and 2 brothers. But dreams remained just dreams, because soon the trailer was filled with a baby's cries again. In 2008, Melissa and Lucas had a daughter named Sierra. Lucas and Melissa were determined to give their little girl a better life. Since they were still very young, Melissa was only 20, they relied completely on help from her parents. Angie and Roy were thrilled to become grandparents. Little Sierra brought enormous joy into the home and gave their world new meaning. When everything around them seemed to be falling apart, their granddaughter became the bond that held the Nepier family together. Angie spent more and more time with the baby and with Roy. Still, Angie and Roy never fully repaired their marriage and eventually decided to separate. Surprisingly, once they realized they were better as close friends than as husband and wife, their relationship improved. Angie felt comfortable coming to Roy's trailer to be with the family, and a couple of years after the breakup, she decided to move on with her life and started dating a man named Jim Wilson. Jim lived in Decatur County, almost 3 hours from Laurel, and Angie eventually moved in with him, but whenever she could, she drove to the trailer to see her family. Jim wasn't thrilled about those trips, but nothing could stop Angie from seeing her loved ones. She was very proud of her grown children. Melissa had just finished her training and earned her certificate. Her sons had found jobs and were now supporting their father and themselves. Roy was still recovering from his back injury and couldn't work because of his disability. Things weren't perfect, but they were managing to get by. September 25th, 2011, everything changed forever. Around 1:30 p.m., a random driver was coming down the hill. Right in front of Steve's Hill Cemetery, he saw something strange in the middle of the road and couldn't immediately tell what it was. As he got closer and slowed down, he realized it was a little girl walking alone in the road with no adults around. The man pulled over to make sure the child was okay. The girl's eyes were red from crying, her hair was a mess, and she was covered in something. When he got closer, he saw it wasn't dirt, it was blood. Shocked, the driver couldn't understand how this tiny child ended up completely alone near a cemetery with no houses nearby. He asked where her mommy was, and the girl's answer stunned him even more. She said her mommy was dead. The situation felt unreal, like a nightmare, except the child was standing right in front of him, with crosses and headstones rising on both sides of the road. The driver called 911 and reported the child on the highway. Police arrived instantly. This was the only road in or out of the area. Eventually, the little girl was identified as 3-year-old Sierra, daughter of 23-year-old Melissa Napier, and granddaughter of Angie and Roy. Her great-grandmother Shirley Cummins, who owned land in the area, was notified that her great-granddaughter had been found wandering alone. She rushed over, horrified that Sierra could have been hit by a car or gotten lost in the woods and never found. Shirley was ready to be furious with her son Roy and granddaughter Melissa for not watching the child closely enough to let her walk so far from home. She rocked the little girl in her arms, calming her, and when she asked what happened, she nearly fainted from shock herself. Sierra said her mommy, grandma, and grandpa were dead and she didn't know where to go. Honestly, Shirley couldn't believe what she was hearing. It meant her son was gone, along with his ex-wife. What could have happened? What scared Sierra so badly that she left the house? Why was she left alone? There were too many questions, and the police took over finding the answers. Officers headed to the Napier family trailer to figure out what really happened. Shirley told them where her son and his family lived. As soon as the officers looked inside the mobile home, they knew they needed backup, including major crime detectives. They called Indiana State Police for help, and in the meantime, searched the outside area to make sure the perpetrator wasn't hiding nearby and still a threat. Suddenly, they spotted a man moving through the bushes near the Napier home. Officers ordered him to stop, but instead the man took off running toward the woods as fast as he could. The stranger disappeared in seconds. He clearly knew the area well, and they never caught him. Police frantically searched the surroundings for evidence and eventually found an abandoned vehicle. Most likely it belonged to the fleeing man, someone who didn't want to talk to law enforcement. They ran the plates, just in case. The truck was registered to a local man named Dustin Lane. Now Dustin Lane was on the police radar. There was no telling what connection he might have to whatever happened inside the Napier trailer. Soon there were at least 5 police cars at the scene. Residents, seeing several emergency vehicles speeding down their quiet country road, started coming outside and talking among themselves. They didn't yet know what had happened, but they could feel something terrible had. For most longtime locals, a large police presence meant a catastrophe. Nothing stays secret long in a small town. Word of the crime at the Napier place spread instantly. Everyone was speculating what could have caused such a commotion in their sleepy community, even though the detectives themselves hadn't figured it out yet. When an Indiana State Police sergeant arrived, he was told there were multiple victims inside the trailer. He only had to glance through the window to see the horrific scene awaiting them. Officers held off entering the home to preserve evidence. While waiting for the crime scene team, local deputies focused on finding Dustin Lane, the man who had run into the woods. The danger was that the fugitive might be armed and capable of anything if cornered. Meanwhile, several detectives finally entered the trailer to assess the situation. The first thing that hit them was pools of blood. Blood was splattered everywhere in the small space. Right in the middle of the living room lay 2 lifeless bodies. A little farther back were 2 more. 2 men and 2 women, covered in red almost beyond recognition. It was beyond comprehension. They knew what they were looking at, but didn't want to believe such a horrific crime could happen in their quiet town. 4 people were dead. It was the most shocking incident in Laurel's entire history. First, the victims had to be identified. Neighbors and Shirley Cummins confirmed that Roy Napier lived in the trailer with his children, Jacob, Melissa, and Joshua. But according to 3-year-old Sierra, the victims included her mother, Melissa, her grandma, Angie, and her grandpa, Roy. That was only preliminary identification. In reality, investigators couldn't even properly examine the scene inside the trailer yet. The bodies took up the entire small living area, surrounded by scattered belongings. Empty wallets lay on the floor. Victims' pockets were turned inside out. Drawers had been pulled out and their contents dumped. There were empty food containers, pill bottles, prescription slips, newspapers, magazines, TV remotes, children's toys, and spent shell casings. At first glance, it was impossible to tell what was evidence and what was everyday clutter. It looked as if someone had been searching for money or valuables and simply tossed everything else on the floor. Now those items were soaked in blood. All the victims had been shot. Could one of them have done it and then turned the gun on themselves? The questions kept growing. While detectives tried to collect evidence inside, they were told there were blood drops outside the trailer too. The perpetrator may have been injured, so specialists carefully followed the trail step by step until they found another body. The 5th victim lay face up on the ground, but there wasn't much of a face left. It had been beaten into a pulp. By the size, it was an adult male, clearly not the person who had killed the 4 inside. It could have been one of Roy and Angie's adult sons, but that doubt was quickly cleared up. The last victim's pockets hadn't been emptied. Inside was a wallet with ID belonging to Henry Smith. His cell phone lay next to the body and was immediately taken for examination. Although the area around Henry's body was soaked in blood, the phone was perfectly clean, as if someone had wiped it carefully before placing it there. The battery was dead, so no further information could be obtained right away. The phone was sent to the crime lab, along with other evidence for forensic analysis. Strangely, no other cell phones were found in the trailer and no firearm either. All 5 deaths were ruled homicides. That meant the person who had killed 5 innocent people was still at large. Locals immediately decided the killer must be an outsider, 100% certain no one from their town could do something so monstrous. While the investigative team worked inside the trailer, a man approached one of the police cars parked behind the tape. He looked rough, his whole body scratched and bleeding, fresh bruises on his face and hands. He asked to speak with detectives. It was none other than Dustin Lane, the man who had fled into the woods hours earlier. Everyone knows criminals sometimes return to the scene, but this man claimed he came back to clear his name. Dustin explained he had done some work for Roy Napier and had come to collect payment. Lane had a record, so when he saw all the police cars, he panicked and ran. He insisted he had nothing to do with what happened inside the trailer. He hadn't even reached it when he saw the officers. When locals told him about the horrific crime, he returned to explain his flight and clear his name. It sounded plausible, but Dustin Lane stayed on the suspect list. However, another name was now added. Evidence collection and the investigation went on for hours, from morning until night. All 5 victims were transported to the Forensic Pathology Institute in Indianapolis, Indiana, for autopsies. Finally, the bodies were officially identified. They were 50-year-old family head Roy Napier, his 47-year-old ex-wife Angela Napier, their 23-year-old daughter Melissa, Sierra's mother, and their 17-year-old son Jacob, who would have turned 18 in just a few weeks. The 5th victim was 43-year-old Henry Smith, a neighbor who lived across the road from the trailer. Sierra said Henry had helped her escape the house. That likely explained why he was outside when he saved the girl. He was the Napier family's best friend. He spent a lot of time with them, helped around the house, and played with the kids. One piece of evidence at the scene clearly belonged to the potential killer, a bloody shoe print from an athletic sneaker with a distinctive sole pattern. Investigators also found something interesting in the bedroom nightstand. A restraining order application filled out by Roy Napier against his own son, 26-year-old Joshua. Just a week before his death, Roy had gone to the courthouse. He wanted to keep his oldest son away from him. It was clear the father feared his own child for some reason. And Joshua was not among the victims found in the trailer. Family disputes often escalate from arguments to violence. In light of this new information, Joshua Napier became suspect number 1. Roy's mother, Shirley Cummins, explained the situation at the Napier home to officers. She said Roy had kicked his oldest son out a week earlier. They argued often because Joshua wanted to control everything, including the family finances. He wanted to take over running the household, taking advantage of his father's disability and poor health. Roy didn't like being pushed out of his role as head of the family, so he threw the young man out and went further. He filed for a protective order, with a hearing scheduled for that very week. It was entirely possible Joshua had resented his father and been jealous that his brother and sister were allowed to stay in the trailer while he had to move in with his girlfriend. For the Napier relatives, losing several loved ones at once felt unbearable and senseless. They knew there were occasional arguments at Roy's place, but no one could have imagined it would end like this. What sense was there in wiping out an entire family that had no wealth and had never harmed anyone? The crime sent shockwaves through all of Laurel. Schools were put on lockdown, children were handed directly to parents, and outdoor activities were temporarily suspended. Since no one had been arrested yet, further attacks were possible, so administrators decided to err on the side of caution. The lockdown was just a precaution. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with the terrible news. A huge number of reporters descended on the quiet place, eager for first-hand accounts, interviewing anyone willing to talk. The investigation continued, but slower than anyone wanted. The problem was that detectives simply didn't know who to look for or where to start. The exact time of the crime was still unknown. Sierra was found around 1:30 p.m., but no one knew how long she had been walking to the cemetery. One neighbor thought she heard shots around noon, but she wasn't sure. Police suspected various people, including Joshua Napier. They didn't have far to look. The young man lived with his girlfriend just a few miles from his father's trailer. As soon as Joshua heard about the tragedy, he rushed to the scene, even though officers had already put out a search for him after not finding him at home. When he was told his parents and siblings had been shot, he broke down in tears. Once the initial emotions subsided, officers asked Joshua why his father had filed a restraining order against him. It seemed to come as news to him. The oldest son had a difficult relationship with his father, but he claimed he'd never heard anything about a restraining order. Joshua said his parents argued more about their own relationship issues. Angie's new boyfriend didn't like Roy, and Roy strongly disliked him in return. The ex-husband couldn't accept that Angie had left and was now living with another man. Jim Wilson and Roy Napier, to put it mildly, couldn't stand each other. Jim got upset whenever Angie went to the trailer to see her kids, and Roy was distressed when she went back to Jim. He still couldn't come to terms with his wife leaving the family and moving so far away. According to Joshua, Jim harbored deep, hidden hatred toward his father. He had tried countless times to stop Angie from visiting the trailer and spending time with her family. As it later turned out, a car was parked not far from the trailer, and no one had come for it yet. The plates showed it belonged to James Wilson, Angela's new partner. Joshua himself helped police figure out what connection this man had to the Napier family. Since Jim clearly wasn't fond of Roy, could he have committed such a horrific crime? Until the killer was in custody, everyone remained under suspicion. Joshua told officers he had spent the entire night and morning at his girlfriend's house. In reality, he would have preferred to be at the family trailer so he could have confronted the attacker and tried to save his loved ones. The young man spoke sincerely, but who knows, he might have been a good actor. What bothered the police was the footwear Joshua was wearing, athletic sneakers with the exact sole pattern that left the bloody print at the trailer entrance. They asked him to hand over the shoes for testing to compare with the evidence. After that, they let Joshua go, but put him under surveillance. Meanwhile, detectives explored other leads. First on the list was what Sierra might say. She had been an unwitting eyewitness to the massacre. Though a 3-year-old's testimony couldn't be relied on completely, everything she had said so far had checked out. Investigators spoke with her temporary guardians. They learned Sierra had mentioned Uncle Jim hurting her mommy. Though it came from a child's mouth, Jim's car was parked near the crime scene, and he certainly had a motive. The crime lab returned results on the phone found next to the 5th victim. It belonged to Angela Nepier. The SIM card had been removed and all text messages deleted, but the contact list remained and could be checked. Strangely, Angie's phone had no numbers for Roy or son Jacob, only Melissa's. Police decided to track the location of one of the victims' phones. None had been found in the trailer. Cell phone pinging is a long and tedious process, so detectives didn't expect quick results. In the meantime, they paid a visit to Jim Wilson. Police showed up at Wilson's house early in the morning. First, they asked how his car ended up on Steve's Hill near the crime scene. The explanation was convincing. Angie had taken it to visit her family. When asked if he had heard anything about the bloody massacre in Laurel, he said he'd seen it on the news, but didn't know details. The detectives then asked directly if he was aware that his girlfriend Angela Nepier had been shot along with her family. The man froze, speechless with shock. He couldn't believe Angie was really gone. Jim nervously explained to the officers how much he hated those trips, and it wasn't just jealousy. What bothered him was that strangers kept showing up at the Nepier trailer. Angie had told him herself. He had asked her to meet the kids on neutral ground, but Roy was still family to her, and no one could make her give up those visits. Roy, now disabled from his back injury, had fallen into despair over money and started selling his prescription painkillers. Empty prescription bottles had indeed been found at the scene. Drugs meant only for severe pain, injuries, even cancer. Because of the euphoric high, people began abusing them. Those were exactly the kind of addicts Jim feared, while he was 3 hours away and unable to protect Angie if needed. On the morning of Sunday, the day of the murders, Jim had a solid alibi. He was hosting a barbecue with friends. Police called his buddies, and they all confirmed he had been there the whole time. It was far enough away that slipping out, committing the crime, and returning unnoticed would have been nearly impossible. He had no criminal record, so for now all suspicion was lifted from him. But the information about missing prescription drugs piqued investigators' interest. They had already heard from locals that Roy was selling pills. Since no drugs were found in the trailer, they had dismissed it as gossip. To confirm or refute the story, detectives went back to Joshua Nepier and told him straight out they knew what his father had been doing. Joshua didn't deny it. He admitted his father sometimes sold pills to make a little money while suffering constant pain. That was the main reason for their arguments. The oldest son didn't like what his father was doing. But at that point in life, it was Roy's only way to support the family, so he wasn't about to let Joshua stand in his way. Opioid addiction in remote areas of Indiana is one of the state's biggest problems, and unfortunately, it became an indirect cause of an entire family's death. As soon as the Nepiers started making ends meet, in 2008, the family grew again. Little Sierra was born. A child always means extra expenses. Money was desperately short. With almost no jobs in rural areas like Laurel, people have little chance to improve their lives. It's a vicious cycle. Heavy manual labor is the only work available, and it often leads to injury. People seek medical help but don't want to lose their jobs, so instead of treating the underlying problem, they just mask the pain with medication. That's exactly what happened to Roy Nepier. His condition turned into a disability, and the family still had to eat. So the man found a small side income. Police asked Joshua if any buyers had seemed suspicious, anyone who owed money or acted strangely. Joshua remembered one guy. He didn't even know his name, but something about him stood out. He didn't know the buyer's address but offered to show where the house was. He had once gone with his father to deliver pills there. The house belonged to a woman named Berlina Blondie Richardson. Detectives learned she lived with her son David Azen and was a distant relative of Angie, née Richardson. That same year, just a few months earlier, there had been an armed pharmacy robbery. The robber tried to smash the display glass and was badly injured in the process. His blood landed on a pharmacist. He escaped, but DNA identified him. The robber was David Azen, with more than 20 prior convictions. Police even had an active warrant for him, but he was on the run and the pharmacy case remained unsolved. David was wanted for trying to steal prescription pills. Now Joshua had pointed to him as a regular buyer from his father. Someone the police knew as David Azen might go to extreme lengths for his fix. He had spent most of his adult life in prison and could easily slaughter an entire family. Police obtained a search warrant for Azen's home and planned to arrest him at the first opportunity. Melissa Nepier's missing phone was last pinged in the area where David lived. The takedown was scheduled for September 28th. SWAT didn't want to storm the house. There was no telling how a man like that might react. They needed him alive. This was potentially the person who had murdered an entire family. The team waited until David and his girlfriend got into their car to leave. They were arrested at a nearby gas station when Azen least expected it. The most surprising part? The man was wearing a fake beard and glasses. He may have been in disguise and ready to flee again at any moment. In the trunk, they found a loaded handgun and a rifle, another violation since he was prohibited from owning firearms. At Azen's house, they recovered bloody clothing, Melissa Nepier's cell phone, and athletic shoes whose sole pattern matched the bloody print at the crime scene. The sneakers had been washed, however, so blood traces could no longer be proven. When David asked why he was being arrested, officers first mentioned the pharmacy robbery. When they brought up Roy Napier, Azen acted like he'd never heard the name, even though rumors about the massacre were all over town. He didn't look scared or nervous. As soon as the conversation turned to the dead, he shut down and asked for a lawyer. A man with multiple convictions knew how to behave in an interrogation. Bail was set at $5 million, $1 million for each life police believed he had taken. He hadn't yet been formally charged with the trailer murders, but every piece of circumstantial evidence pointed to him. The arrest brought relief to the public. On one hand, people breathed easier knowing the killer was behind bars. On the other, they didn't want to believe one of their own, who lived next door and walked the same streets, could do this. The news stunned the community and made everyone look more closely at their neighbors. Who knew what secrets were hidden behind closed doors? Some were convinced police had arrested the wrong man. For the person who had lost his entire family overnight, the arrest was a small comfort. 26-year-old Joshua Napier now had to organize funerals for 4 family members. Locals donated money. They knew Joshua had nothing to give his loved ones a proper send-off. Laurel didn't even have a funeral home big enough for 4 coffins at once, or enough hearses. Vehicles had to be brought in from other towns. The Napier family was buried at the same cemetery where the passing driver had found little Sierra wandering alone. Not far from Roy, Angie, Melissa, and Jacob, they buried family friend Henry Smith, who had given his life to save Sierra. Charges for the murder of 5 people were formally filed against David Azen on October 9, 2011. When the suspect realized the walls were closing in, he started blaming his girlfriend while denying everything himself. The woman arrested with Azen was his live-in girlfriend, Amanda Napier. Yes, she had the same last name as the victims, but no direct relation. It turned out the name came from an ex-husband who also had no connection to Roy and Angie, just a coincidence of surnames. In a town of just over 500 people, that wasn't unusual. Perhaps their distant ancestors had been related. Her ex-husband told police Amanda had started dating David without knowing how dangerous he was. Once she realized, she couldn't leave because of threats against her 3 children who lived with their father. Azen warned he would kill not only Amanda, but the kids too, so she stayed out of fear. But fear wasn't the only thing keeping her with him. She had fallen deep into addiction herself. Leaving David meant losing her supply. On her own, she had neither money nor access to the next high. Deep down, Amanda wanted to change her life, go back to college, become a nurse. But the addiction was stronger than her human desires. Authorities wanted to know if this woman had any involvement in the deaths of 5 people in the Napier trailer. At that point, she wasn't charged with murder. On September 30th, she was arrested for conspiracy to commit the pharmacy robbery. Her connection to the trailer massacre still had to be determined. During questioning, Amanda told investigators she had stayed in the car while David went to Roy's to buy pills. He came back and said he had argued with the owner. She claimed she didn't even know David was armed when he went inside. On October 13th, 2011, a hearing was held where Azen pleaded not guilty to all 5 murder charges. He was brought to court in shackles and a bulletproof vest, fearing revenge from angry relatives. Even without the death penalty on the table, he faced multiple life sentences, one for each Napier family member. Evidence against David kept piling up. He realized denying everything was pointless, and on February 14th, 2012, Valentine's Day, David Azen accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty. In exchange, he avoided execution and received life without parole. Even the judge said David claimed to feel remorse. But when one of the victim's relatives shouted a curse at him, he immediately fired back with profanity. It became clear the man felt no regret at all for taking 5 innocent lives and would gladly do it again. Joshua Napier, the young man who had lost his entire family in one day, was unhappy with the deal. In his view, Azen didn't deserve to keep his life. David's family could still visit him in prison, but Joshua would never again see his mother, father, sister, or little brother. Prison for David was like a second home. 3 meals a day, opportunities for self-improvement, and life continuing, even if never free again. Poor little Sierra now lives with her father. She will carry the memory of those horrific moments when her loved ones died in front of her. Joshua has been forbidden from seeing the girl. It would cause her too much pain, so in essence, he has lost that last connection to his late sister as well. The only consolation was that the plea deal forced David to tell the full truth about what happened in the Napier trailer on September 25, 2011. David Azen's addiction to prescription opioids had completely taken over his life. He paid for it not only with cash, but with his health. Missing even 1 dose made him violently ill. He would do anything to make the pain stop and get more pills. He usually bought from Roy Napier, whose back pain earned him strong prescriptions. When money was short, he stole pills from pharmacies or acquaintances. This time the craving was especially bad, so he arranged to buy 50 pills at once and told Roy in advance. He and Amanda drove to the Napier place on Steves Hill Road, but Roy had bad news. He only had 30 pills left. Worse, Roy had raised the price from $10 to $12 each. He explained he had lost his insurance and now paid full price for his own meds. That was why the increase. David felt cheated. He was sure Roy had sold his pills to someone else and was now gouging him. A heated argument broke out. Azen refused to pay a penny more. Roy refused to lower the price. At that moment, Roy's ex-wife Angie and adult children Jacob and Melissa were in the trailer with little Sierra. Hearing the shouting, they got involved. Melissa told David to pay full price or leave. She made some sudden movement toward him, and that was the moment he snapped. He decided he would take the pills no matter what. If they wouldn't sell, he would take them by force. David pulled a gun, pointed it at Melissa, and fired. Angie, standing nearby, lunged at him with her fists. He beat her face and then shot her too. He had to kill Roy and Jacob as well, or they would have killed him. Once he was sure everyone inside was dead, he ransacked the place looking for pills, dumping drawers on the floor while stuffing anything valuable into his pockets. phones, cash, cheap jewelry he could pawn. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement in the kitchen, Sierra hiding. Then, neighbor and family friend Henry Smith suddenly appeared in the doorway. Henry had heard the shots and run over to help. He instantly realized his friends were dead, grabbed Sierra, and ran outside. Somehow he got her out. He told her to run as far away as possible while he tried to hold Azen off. Azen caught up, beat Henry's face to a pulp in rage, then shot him in the chest. David wanted no witnesses. When he finished, he noticed the little girl had escaped. Figuring a 3-year-old couldn't identify him, he dismissed her existence. David spoke about it all with ice-cold detachment, as if taking human lives was nothing special. In his mind, they were to blame for standing in his way. Amanda Napier was convicted as an accomplice. She sat in the car while David executed Roy's family. She heard the shots but did nothing, didn't intervene, didn't call police, and went on living with Azen. By then, addiction had likely stripped away whatever humanity she had left. In 2014, Amanda Napier was sentenced to 12 years in prison plus probation. In total, she served 20 years. Even David's 64-year-old mother, Berlina Blondie Richardson, was arrested for illegally buying a semi-automatic firearm for her son. A mother paid dearly for her foolishness. 5 deaths and several families shattered by grief. It all came down to a tiny pill that has destroyed millions of lives on Earth. Addicts will commit any crime for the next high. Even the people closest to them, once loved, cannot stop them. But can any substance ever be worth a human life? If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. What drives people to commit crimes? Most often, it's selfish motives, money, power. In some cases, a crime is committed out of hatred or love. But what if someone simply gets bored? Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Richard Alden Samuel McCroskey III was born on December 26, 1988, in Hayward, California. Later, the whole family moved to Castro Valley. As a child, Richard was quite shy, but at the same time, well-mannered and kind. He just kept to himself and never caused anyone any trouble. Music was a huge part of Richard's life. His father played guitar in a rock band and had a strong influence on his son's musical taste. It was his father who introduced him to bands like Metallica and Primus. Even in elementary school, Richard had trouble communicating with peers and found it hard to fit in. Over the years, he became a real outcast. In high school, he started getting bullied because of his weight and red hair. With the strength of his secretive nature, the teenager endured it all alone and never let his emotions show. One day, when classmates began physically assaulting Richard, he just stood there submissively, taking the blows without fighting back. His sister Sarah witnessed the scene. She told their parents about the incident, and they transferred him to another school. Unfortunately, the bullying continued at the new school. Eventually, Richard gave up even before he could get his high school diploma. He dropped out without finishing his education. Richard always found it hard to make friends, so he spent most of his time alone. He had his own ways of escaping harsh reality. The teenager spent whole days in his room playing violent video games and listening to heavy metal, but his real salvation became the social network MySpace. MySpace, translated from English as MySpace, was one of the first international social networks. It was a community site and blogging platform where users could create interest-based groups, personal profiles, keep blogs, post photos and videos, and listen to tracks by popular artists. McCroskey spent a lot of time on MySpace. It became a kind of addiction for him. Of course, social networks in general can be very useful. They help people find communities of shared interests and make new friends from all over the world. That's exactly what attracted Richard. He turned to MySpace and found music lover communities there that shared his passion for his favorite genre. McCroskey met other enthusiastic teens and for the first time truly felt like he belonged. His father had introduced him to heavy rock, but then the young man discovered a new direction, horrorcore, and became literally obsessed. Horrorcore is a subgenre of hip-hop whose lyrical content is based on horror movie imagery, or can be even more terrifying, describing the darkest vices of human nature, raw, unmasked violence. Most horrorcore songs touched on themes of death, bullying, mutilation, torture, the occult, mental disorders, and many other dark topics. Richard McCroskey was mesmerized by extreme music with grim lyrics and all kinds of obscenities. It was a new world he plunged into head first. In short, horrorcore and MySpace became Richard's main outlet. It was what he was truly passionate about. The teenager even started making his own horrorcore music. The lyrics of his songs could easily scare an unprepared listener. Richard wrote about voices in his head constantly telling him to take someone's life, about wanting to carry out a mass slaughter and quickly get rid of rotting corpses. There was a lot of controversy around horrorcore. Some people believed that music and lyrics of this kind encouraged crime. But it was worth remembering that music is just a form of expression, and the fact that someone sings about death and wanting to take lives doesn't mean they're actually going to pick up a weapon and kill someone. After all, people who write horror movie scripts don't go out on the streets and start bringing their ideas to life. It's simply a form of self-expression. In Richard McCroskey's case, music of this genre, where violence was mentioned, serial killers and their crimes were romanticized and glorified, apparently somehow affected the teenager's impressionable mind. But that's more the exception than the rule. Since Richard was now making music himself, he needed a stage name. Behind the veil of the internet, the usually shy and awkward young man appeared as Psycho Sam, a psychopath obsessed with violence and loving bloody scenes. Psycho Sam was the nickname under which the guy posted his creepy lyrics on MySpace. It was a reference to David Berkowitz, the 1970s New York serial killer who called himself the Son of Sam. In addition to his MySpace page, Richard McCroskey ran a YouTube channel called Little Demon Dog, again referencing David Berkowitz. There he posted videos of his petty delinquent acts, like going to a cemetery and turning over crosses. In his videos, he drank alcohol, sometimes used illegal drugs, and had fun. Thanks to his new passion, McCroskey became one of the biggest horrorcore fans and finally made some friends. In the summer of 2008, 19-year-old Richard was living with his parents and working part-time as a web designer. He built websites for people in the horror industry. It was thanks to his online persona and small fame in the horrorcore world that around the same time, Richard met a 15-year-old girl from the other side of the country who was also a fan of the genre. A friendship formed that eventually turned into a long-distance romance. Her name was Emma Niederbrock. She lived in Farmville, Virginia, with her father Mark, a pastor who had led the local Presbyterian church for the past 6 years, and her mother Deborah Kelly, a professor of sociology and criminal justice at Longwood University. Dr. Kelly mentored students, many of whom went on to successful careers in law enforcement, fire services, and related fields, applying the knowledge she had given them. The Niederbrock family had a wide circle of friends in their hometown. From childhood, Emma had been a sweet, kind girl, but although she grew up in an extremely religious family, as a teenager she rebelled against everything she had been taught. Now she was much more interested in Gothic fashion and the occult than in faith in God. Her friends knew her as a rebel who was obsessed with dark music, yet still listened to the Backstreet Boys and played soccer. One day, her mother came across creepy writings Emma had used to decorate her bedroom walls. The woman was very worried about her daughter's behavior and decided all the negativity was coming from her school environment. After consulting with Emma's father, the mother decided to pull her daughter out of school to protect her from temptation. At her parents' insistence, Emma switched to homeschooling. but apparently the strictness of her father and mother produced the exact opposite result. Locked inside four walls, Emma developed yet another new passion: the MySpace horrorcore community. Online, Emma used the nickname Ragdoll. So in September 2008, Emma met a young man named Seco Sam. They started chatting online and soon discovered they had a lot in common. The guy had dropped out of high school. Emma was also homeschooled, so both teens felt isolated from society. They were into the same music and loved the horror atmosphere. Just a few months after they met, almost simultaneously, both experienced their parents' divorce. Richard's mother left home, leaving her adult son with his father. With Emma, it was the opposite. Now she lived with her mother. Despite the separation, her parents remained close and both stayed actively involved in their daughter's life. Now the young people not only messaged each other on social media, but talked on the phone almost every day. The only thing, they had never met in person. Since Richard had been an outcast his whole life, he quickly developed strong feelings for Emma, who understood him like no one else. McCroskey genuinely fell in love and already considered Emma his girlfriend in his heart. Emma Niederbrock, for her part, was also smitten. Richard was older and perfectly suited to be a boyfriend, though a high school girl probably wasn't thinking that far ahead, since they lived on opposite sides of the country. September 2009 arrived. The young people had been talking for 12 months, but had never met face to face. At that point, Richard turned 20 and Emma 16. Finally, the time came when they decided to meet in real life. On September 12th, a festival was scheduled in Detroit, Michigan, featuring several bands both were fans of. They decided to seize the opportunity and go to the concert together. For Richard, it was the only good news in a while, because he still couldn't come to terms with his parents' divorce. Even though he had to travel across the entire country for this meeting, McCroskey was determined. Emma also had high hopes for the festival. She couldn't wait to show her best side to the mysterious California guy. Emma also wanted to bring her friend, 18-year-old Melanie Wells. Melanie lived in West Virginia and had met Niederbrock through MySpace and the horrorcore community. Like Emma, she was homeschooled, so the girls quickly became best friends despite living in different states. It was horrorcore music, with its violent lyrics mixed with hip-hop beats, that brought Richard, Emma, and her friend Melanie together. On top of that, at the festival, they could meet other community members and some young musicians. So the three friends planned to go to the festival, but since they lived in different places, they needed a plan to meet up. The plan was this: Richard and Melanie would fly into Richmond, Virginia, and stay at Emma's house in Farmville. Then, her parents would drive all three to the festival, which was a 10-hour drive away. When Emma told her mom about the plan, Deborah was very surprised. She had nothing against her friend Melanie, but she didn't like the idea of an unknown 20-year-old guy she had never met staying in their house for several days. As mentioned earlier, Deborah Kelly was a professor of sociology and criminal justice, so she saw hidden motives and red flags in everything. In the end, her daughter managed to convince her mom that everything would be fine. The woman agreed on one condition: she would personally chaperone them to the festival and keep an eye on her daughter. On September 11, 2009, Richard McCroskey boarded a plane and flew from Castro Valley, California to Richmond, Virginia. The guy was very nervous. He was about to meet the girl he had long considered his own. He had been waiting for this moment for a long time and was incredibly excited. Just before boarding, Richard received a very tender message from Emma saying that the next time he logged into his MySpace page, he would be at her house. The guy was eagerly anticipating his first meeting with his beloved. But for Richard, everything went wrong. When Emma saw the mysterious Seco Sam at the airport, she was shocked by the difference between his online photos and his real appearance. He didn't look anything like his internet pictures. In fact, Richard had put a lot of effort into altering his appearance in photos. He chose the most flattering angles, tried to make himself look slimmer and taller, and edited his facial features to appear more attractive. Emma was stunned by how different he was from his own photos. Surprisingly, it wasn't just Richard's appearance that was different. His entire MySpace personality was fake. Online, the person under the nickname Seco Sam acted like a cool guy, but in real life, he was completely different. Shy, timid, and awkward. The image that had attracted Emma simply didn't exist. Standing in front of her was a modest, short, slightly overweight guy. His cheeks burned red, matching his hair color. Not from the cold, but from inner turmoil. It was obvious at a glance how hard it was for him to communicate with people outside the virtual world. Emma was shocked and stunned. She simply hadn't expected such a huge gap between the online persona and reality. The girl tried to act like everything was fine, but from the moment they met, she lost all interest in the guy. Richard clearly read disappointment in her eyes. Apparently, her first reaction to her virtual boyfriend was too obvious. Then, Melanie Wells arrived. The internet friends spent the evening at Emma's house, and the next day, Saturday, September 12th, they set off on the 10-hour drive to the Horrorcore Music Festival. Deep down, Richard hoped they would have fun, and that once Emma got to know him better, she would change her mind. But that didn't happen. Emma barely paid any attention to Richard, and worse, right in front of him, she flirted with other guys at the festival. He even saw them exchanging text messages. The guy still tried to please the girl he had long considered his own, but got absolutely no response. It became clear that after the festival, Emma would most likely cut off all contact with Richard and forget about him. The girl was only 16 and probably didn't think about how much her indifference hurt him. Later, festival attendees who knew Emma and Richard from the MySpace horrorcore community said they had seen them at the concert, but no one remembered the teens hanging out together. Emma confessed to one of her virtual friends who had also come to the festival that McCroskey creeped her out. In the end, Richard felt completely rejected by Emma. He was hurt by her behavior at the festival. Nevertheless, he returned to the Niederbrock house with the girls. Once back in Farmville, the guy's anger and confusion about his relationship with Emma only grew. Richard sincerely believed that their online correspondence had created a real romantic connection. And now he was terribly upset watching his supposed girlfriend no longer want anything to do with him. But no one could have imagined what Richard was willing to do to take revenge on the girl who had supposedly made him fly across the country just to reject him. So after the concert, the teens returned to Farmville. They planned to spend a few more days at Emma's before Richard and Melanie went home. On Monday, Melanie posted on MySpace that the festival had been amazing, and on Wednesday, she would return to West Virginia. Meanwhile, she would keep hanging out at Emma's. According to Richard, nothing changed at the house. Emma did everything she could to avoid talking to him. She simply ignored him, spending all her time with Melanie. Naturally, the guy felt extremely uncomfortable. But instead of packing his things and leaving, Richard started getting angry. As his anger grew with every passing hour, he began drinking heavily, smoking weed, and using other illegal substances. All of this, combined with bitter resentment, caused Richard to snap. On Tuesday, September 15th, 2009, more than 300 kilometers from Farmville, Kathleen and Thomas Wells from West Virginia tried for hours to reach their daughter Melanie, who was staying at her friend Emma Niederbrock's house. They were worried because they hadn't heard from her in several days. Finally, unable to bear the anxiety, Thomas Wells got in his car and drove to Farmville to check if everything was okay and bring his daughter home. When he arrived, the house looked empty to him. The shutters were tightly closed, the doors locked. No one answered his knocking. He settled in his car and prepared to wait for someone to return. After 7 hours of waiting, Thomas gave up and drove back to West Virginia empty-handed. The next day, Wednesday, September 16th, Melanie still hadn't come home. Kathleen Wells, her mother, panicked. She started calling everyone who might have any information. Kathleen learned that Melanie had been seen at the music festival with Emma and a young man, but after that, the trail went cold. The woman kept calling Farmville until finally someone picked up the phone at the house. The person who answered introduced himself as Richard McCroskey. He said Melanie had gone to the movies with Emma and hung up without explaining anything. Kathleen found the conversation extremely suspicious and decided to call the police to get clarity. When officers arrived, they spoke with Richard, who repeated that the girls had gone to the movies. Law enforcement did no further investigation because the check concerned an adult woman. Getting no help from police, Kathleen called Mark Niederbrock, Emma's father, who lived nearby, and asked him to check the house in Farmville. Mark assured her he would go right away and call back as soon as he knew what was going on. But he never called back. When Kathleen still couldn't reach either her daughter or Emma's father on September 18th, she called the police station again and convinced them to return to the Niederbrock house. Officers arrived around 3 p.m. No one answered the door, but the front door was unlocked. As soon as they entered, the officers were hit with the horrible smell of decomposition. Then they discovered the bodies of Emma, Deborah, Melanie, and Mark. All four were dead. However, the young man who had answered the door the day before and said the girls went to the movies was nowhere in the house. Richard McCroskey was immediately declared wanted. If the guy wasn't involved in the deaths of 4 people, he could be a witness and in danger. But where was Richard? After killing Mark Niederbrock, the father of his would-be girlfriend, the guy stole the man's keys to his Honda, got in the car, and headed to the airport. He planned to return home to California. However, he didn't make it to the airport. He lost control and drove into a ditch. Highway patrol arrived at the scene. When asked whose car it was, the guy said it belonged to his girlfriend's father. The officer wrote McCroskey a ticket for driving without a license and impounded the Honda. During the conversation, the young man mentioned he was rushing to catch a flight to California, and they let him go. Without a car, Richard decided to hitchhike the rest of the way. A tow truck driver picked him up and agreed to drop him at the airport. Only later did the driver regret it. Richard literally reeked of death. It turned out the young man hadn't showered or changed clothes since committing the crime. As it later emerged, his clothing was soaked in blood and had bits of the victim's flesh on it. Still, the truck driver managed to hold back the urge to vomit and got Richard to the airport. He just rolled down all the windows. McCroskey had no idea the police were already on his trail. When the officer who ticketed Richard returned to the station, he learned the young man was wanted for a brutal massacre. He immediately contacted colleagues and reported that the suspect was heading to Richmond Airport. Early in the morning of September 19, 2009, police found Richard McCroskey asleep on a chair in the baggage claim area. He had spent the night at Richmond International Airport waiting for his flight. He had a ticket for a return flight to California on Sunday. The young man tried to change the flight date, but didn't have enough money to pay the change fee. It was a very calm arrest. Officers approached the guy and asked him to come with them. They didn't even handcuff Richard, who had no prior criminal record. When asked why he staged the massacre in the house, McCroskey calmly said, "Jesus made him do it." Richard was arrested and charged with 4 murders, robbery, and grand theft, auto of the Honda, belonging to the late Mark Niederbrock. From the very beginning, all evidence pointed to the 20-year-old who had flown across the country to meet his online girlfriend and attend a music festival. McCroskey was the last known person to see all 4 victims alive. His entire outfit was soaked through with the victims' blood. MySpace messages indicated a romantic relationship between Emma and Richard. Festival eyewitnesses who also knew the young people from the online community said the guy took the girls' rejection very hard. So the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the guy himself didn't deny killing all 4. After his arrest, McCroskey initially refused to cooperate with police, but after speaking with his lawyer, he agreed to tell how and why he had sent 4 people to the next world. Richard also explained his motive, stating that Emma was the main target. She had to die for rejecting him, and he decided to kill the others so there would be no witnesses. Everything that happened in the Niederbrock house in Farmville is known only from Richard McCroskey's own words. On Tuesday, September 15th, while the whole house was asleep, Richard couldn't sleep. Fueled by alcohol and illegal drugs, he lay in bed replaying the events of the past few days. The exciting anticipation of the trip, the awkward meeting with Emma, her flirting with other guys at the festival. It all drove him crazy, but he held it together, hoping the girl would get to know him better and change her opinion. McCroskey had pinned certain hopes on his relationship with his online girlfriend and had imagined their first meeting after a year spent behind a computer screen very differently. And now he was furious that the real-life meeting with Emma had gone nothing like he planned. Yet, even back at the house in Farmville, Emma paid no attention to Richard and avoided talking to him, spending all her free time with Melanie Wells. The young man was unhappy with how everything was turning out. That became the trigger for what followed. Around 3 a.m., Richard left the guest room, grabbed a 7 to 8 pound maul he found in the backyard, went into the first-floor living room where 18-year-old Melanie Wells was sleeping on the couch. Then he slowly went upstairs to the office of 53-year-old Deborah Kelly and finally entered the downstairs bedroom of 16-year-old Emma Niederbrock, the girl who had rejected him. All three were asleep when Richard attacked them, and all three died from blunt force head trauma. There were no defensive wounds on the victims' bodies. That meant none of them likely even woke up during the attack or realized what was happening. On September 17, 2009, around 5 p.m., 50-year-old Mark Niederbrock, Emma's father, arrived at his ex-wife's house. The man was worried because his daughter and ex-wife hadn't been in touch for several days. Moreover, Melanie Wells's mother had called him and said she also couldn't reach her daughter. As soon as the man opened the door with his key and stepped into the living room, Richard attacked him from behind with the maul. Unfortunately, the element of surprise worked in the killer's favor, and Mark was beaten to death before he could react. McCroskey dragged Mark's body into Emma's first-floor bedroom, where he had already hidden Melanie Wells' body. Then Richard tried to clean bloodstains in the living room to cover his tracks. McCroskey spent a day and a half with the bodies of his girlfriend, her mother, and her friend. He surely realized the full gravity of his crime and simply didn't know what to do next. At some point, McCroskey recorded a video of himself on a digital camera. He knew he had to be punished for what he did and was considering taking his own life. Later, Richard was held at Piedmont Regional Jail under suicide watch. Because of the severity of the crime, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. The likelihood of that outcome was quite real. His attorney convinced Richard to take a plea deal to avoid the ultimate punishment. That's exactly what Richard did. He accepted the deal and pleaded guilty to all 4 counts of first-degree murder. In exchange for the guilty plea, his life was spared, and he was ultimately sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, the defendant said nothing and showed no remorse. All he did in the courtroom was smirk. Most likely, the young man still hadn't fully grasped the tragedy of his situation. Leaving the courthouse, Richard McCroskey smiled again at the reporters and walked toward the van that would take him back to prison. Although the guy didn't show his true feelings, his attorney said he was not actually proud of what he had done. McCroskey also waived his right to appeal, so Richard will most likely never be released and will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Defense attorneys claim the crime had nothing to do with the horrorcore music McCroskey was into. The guy was simply angry that his relationship with Emma Niederbrock fell apart. The other 3, according to Richard, were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Richard himself had created a fantasy world where he portrayed himself as a dark, handsome, and powerful rising star of the horrorcore scene. But when he finally met his online girlfriend in real life, the awkward and socially maladjusted young man didn't live up to her expectations. And just as he had been rejected throughout his teenage years, Emma simply turned away from him. Unfortunately, That rejection became the trigger for the deeply hurt young man. Currently, Richard is incarcerated at Green Rock Correctional Center in Virginia. He is not popular in prison and for the most part is still subjected to ridicule. Although he has refused media interviews, in a conversation with one of his former cellmates, it became clear that McCroskey does regret his crimes after all. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.